Well, we're going to go ahead and get started since you guys are on time, and we'll hope the other two people get on here soon. Okay, so today's class is kind of one of the most important ones that you're going to have, because once you understand the contract, the agreement of sale, you basically know how to answer about 90% of the questions that you're going to get from people on the street, your clients, in how to conduct real estate. So understanding the contract is critical, because in order to present an offer and prepare an offer for your buyer, you need to understand the contract. Also, when you're working on the seller side, you'll need to be able to interpret that contract for your sellers. So this week, we're basically going to be talking about working with buyers, which the first class, being the contract class, is the root of being able to communicate with buyers. Now, I'll do a little bit of role playing here in setting the stage on how we got to this point. Later on in the week, we'll get to working a little bit more in detail on how to get to this point. But so just for the sake of the paperwork part of this and what you need to have in front of you, the first thing you need to be looking at is the MLS. Now, some of you may already be on the MLS. Some of you may not be. Don't worry about that. I can pull up the MLS at some point. And in fact, we will be doing that this week, because we're going to be going through the process of doing a CMA for the buyer. You might think, why do we do that for the buyer? Well, we're trying to help justify the property's price, which is more and more difficult to do these days with the property, with the business being as crazy as it is. But we still want to get an idea that the property that we're buying is going to appraise. We'll do a CMA on the buyer side as well, in that we'll just look at sold properties similar to the one that we're trying to write an offer on, and make sure that it kind of fits at least somewhere in the I guess the range, high and low, of what we expect that property to be worth. So that's going to be part of it. And there'll be some MLS training too, how to set up searches for buyers when they say, hey, I'm looking for X, and okay, well, where do you want it? How big do you want it to be? How many bedrooms do you need it to have? These are the things we're going to go through later on. Once we've gotten to that point where we've taken someone out and we've gotten them to know, like, and trust us, and now they're ready to commit to a purchase, then this is where we're going to have to get involved in actually writing a contract. So what I have here is an actual live contract from one of my sales currently in progress, and we're going to give you an idea of how to get that. I used to do this just with a blank page, and I found it was more beneficial to actually use a live contract so that you can see how to actually fill it out based on that. Now, there's a couple of things you should have in front of you before you get to this point. You might want to take a couple of notes and jot this down. But before you can prepare an agreement of sale, you need to have in front of you a copy of the listing. Easy enough. You're going to pull that off the MLS. As I said, don't worry if you haven't joined the MLS yet. You'll be there soon enough. Second thing you should have is also a copy of the tax record. When you go into the MLS, you can click the listing. If you have the listing opened up, you can click on the tax ID number, and the tax ID number will give you an idea of what the tax record looks like. And that's going to be important for a number of reasons, as you'll see when we go through the agreement of sale. You should also, from the MLS, have a copy of the seller's disclosure, if available, downloaded, so that you can also send that to your buyer. Because what you're going to be doing after you prepare this contract is you're going to set it up to send to your client for them to do an e-signature. That is pretty much the way it's being done 99% of the time at this point in time. However, there are also times when you will actually handwrite a contract. I've got a client right now on the seller side who's in assisted living. She doesn't have email. She doesn't have a cell phone. She's in assisted living. I sold her property, and I have to present all that paperwork in person at her assisted living facility to have her sign the contract. So you'll be able to do that, when you need to. But fortunately, nowadays you can pretty much do everything online, which does make it a little bit easier to do. It also manages to get your offer out there a whole lot quicker that way, and that's also important in this this time is of the essence situation that we're in at the moment. All right, so setting the stage, you should have a copy of the listing, a copy of the tax record. You should have the seller's disclosure and lead paint, by the way, if applicable. That would be properties that are older than 1978. Now, where you won't find a seller's disclosure is if you are selling a property that is bank owned, because the banks are exempt, and possibly if you're selling an estate property. It really depends on who the executor or executrix of the estate is. If it's a family member or relative, then they are still obligated to fill out, even if it's a, not a fully complete disclosure, at least they have to fill out as much as they know about the property. I'm only talking about what the law is here. That's the law in Pennsylvania. Any residential property between 1 and 4 units. So yes, even a 4-unit multi-rental building, okay, will require a seller's disclosure. You get into 5 units and above, believe it or not, you're exempt. That's considered a commercial sale and you don't need a seller's disclosure. I also try to get one done anyway, because it can actually help sell the property when you know the answers to questions like how old is the roof and have you ever had any problems. But for purposes of today, we're strictly talking residential, which means you're generally going to be looking at a single home or up to a 4-unit building and nothing more than that. So having those in front of you will make sense in a couple of minutes as I go through the agreement of sale. So first things first, just to kind of give you a broad view, this is a 14-page document. Okay. And the program I'm in right now is called our Zip Forms program. And you'll be able to create a file based on the address is what I recommend. That's what I did here. And then, of course, all the necessary forms that will accompany this offer will be included here. I'll go through those briefly, but for today's purposes, mostly we're looking at the agreement of sale, and that's what we want to pursue. So real simple. Buyers' names go up top here. So by this time, when you get to the point that you're writing an offer on a property, you should know the names of your buyers. However, it's really easy to ask the question, just because you may have been working with them, how do they want to take title to the property? That's the way to phrase the question. Because someone might say their name is Peggy and it's really Margaret, and you know them as Peggy. Well, their proper name should be what goes on here. I know this is just grade school stuff, but basically you need to ask them how they want to take title to the property. So in this case, I do also recommend you tell them that even if they don't usually do it, they should use their middle initials, unless they've actually got a middle name they want to use, like you might find in a Peggy Sue, let's say. Okay, so if that's the case, then you definitely want to put it down the way they want it titled. If they say, I never use a middle initial or I don't have one, well, just put their first and last name down. That's fine. Now, the seller side, you have to fill out as well. Well, you've never met the seller. How are you going to verify their name? That's where you're going to use the tax record. Now, it will be on 90% of the listings, but sometimes it will not be complete. Like example, it might say Lynn Miller would be the seller, when the tax record shows it's Lynn R. Miller and Aaron C. Miller. So you do want to use both names. Maybe one of them is deceased. You don't know that at this point. So you fill it out the way it is. If one of them, let's say if Aaron would be deceased, then Lynn would be required to bring a death certificate at settlement. But you on the preparing side don't know that. So you want to go by whatever the tax record says. That's why you have it up in front of you. The next block also pertains to having the tax record, okay? So a property is known by its address. In this case, it's 7289 Oriole Road. Let me admit one person here, okay? But at the same time, it may, the post office can change your address anytime they want. So really what you want to do is you want to check with the tax record once again to verify that that's correct. Another common thing you'll see in the multi-list, for example, would be a property will be 7289 Oriole Road, and it might say Heidelberg Township, all of which is correct. However, the actual mailing address is Gurmansville, PA. So therefore, you want to verify what that is. Where do you get that? Again, the tax record. So you get the rest of this stuff too, that not only the 5-digit zip, but the 9-digit. The township will be there. Of course, the county will be there, and the school district will also be on there. Most importantly, the tax ID number will be on there. Now, the tax ID number will be also on the listing, but I've seen agents make a typo and the tax ID is wrong. So you want to use the tax record again to verify that. And one other thing that says here, and this is important, it says tax ID, you should always be able to get that. It does say and or identification, and that would be by way of the parcel, lot, block, deed book, page, recording date, all of that. You don't need any of this stuff if you have this. If you have the tax ID, you don't need this. The only time I've ever used anything under identification other than a tax ID is new construction. Let's say it was a development, and the only thing that we know at this point is it's got a deed or a lot number. It hasn't been assigned a physical address yet. You'll rarely find that because most developments, when they get to the point of actually constructing a home, will have had an address assigned to it from the post office. But I have in the past run into it, rarely, but that's what this whole block is for. You don't need it if you've got this. You've got this long And it's different by way in the different counties. This is a Lehigh County property, usually has this long number followed by -001. And there are other ones that just use letters like Northampton counties, depending on where you are, just use the tax ID from the tax map and you'll be fine. Next block is real simple. This is you. You're the buyer relationship with the PA licensed broker. You're the licensed broker or agent for the buyer in this case. And it's always the buyer side that prepares the agreement of sale, not the seller side. Sellers get contracts, buyers produce contracts or offers, which is what it technically is at this stage. So of course, your company name is here. The license number is going to be here too. Okay. This is actually listed in the program by default, so you don't actually have to look it up. Now, this you may have to look up. We have 3 offices, as you know, in our company. Depending on what office you work out of, that's going to be the address that goes here. Allentown, of course, or East Stroudsburg is different than this. This is my own sale here. I'm the agent on this. I work out of our Bethlehem office. This is the Bethlehem office address. If you work out of the Bethlehem office, this is going to be the one that you're going to use. And the same thing, the phone number and fax number as well, based on the office. If you're not sure what that is, look at your business card. It's going to be on your business card after you get them printed. And you should also be checking buyer agent here, unless you're not. When are you not the buyer agent? When you're a dual agent. No other scenario really matters here. So unless you're selling your own listing, you're probably going to be a buyer's agent, but you could be a dual agent. Over on the right, this is you. So your name is important here. There's 2 lines here because sometimes you may share a listing with someone. I know I do co-list several properties sometimes with other agents. If that's the case, then there's room here for 2 individual agents on here. Your license number, you'll eventually commit this to memory if you don't have it already, but obviously that's where that goes. And how you want to be contacted. I don't use a direct number. I just use my cell phone. It's up to you how you want to do it. Everybody is different. I personally, have, I don't know, 50,000 business cards out there for 35 years that have this phone number on it. Well, maybe not that many. I didn't get this phone number until about 1995 when I bought my first cell phone, but you get what I'm saying. And of course, you should have your company, whatever email address you use. If you have a separate email address for personal and or business, whatever one you gave or will be giving to the board, because when you join the board, you have to give them your professional email address so that they can contact you and you get your you're going to have your personal information up there. So whatever you have here, and I do highly recommend you use your cell number. And of course, you should be checking this box that you are a buyer agent and all company licensees represent the buyer. Now, you will notice that there's a designated agency thing here. I know they cover this in real estate class. Designated agency is something that some companies have. I'm here to tell you officially, we do not. We do not practice designated agency, and there's a reason for that. Designated agency requires buyer agents and seller agents to have separate faxes, phone numbers, separate printers available to them. In other words, buyer agents and seller agents in the same company should not have access to all of the listing information because you're a designated buyer agent or you're a designated seller agent. This works in theory pretty well in small companies. It doesn't work too well in a larger company. It's too hard to police it. Plus, it's too expensive to have all that separate stuff. So most larger companies do not practice designated agency, and we do not as well. We are either buyer agents or we are dual agents, and that's that simple. Okay. On the seller side, here we go. So we're going to check here. So where are we going to get this information? Well, this information is going to be on the listing. So Weichert Realtors is the listing company of this particular property. I pulled that right off the listing. Their license numbers on there, the address of the particular office, and you need to pay attention to that because just like us, Weichert has several offices out there. You want to make sure you're addressing the office that has this particular listing. And this information, their phone number and fax number will also be there. And obviously you're checking seller agent because they're representing the seller. Now, in this particular case, the licensee's name is also on the listing. So is their license number. In this case, she has a cell phone. And in this case, she does also have an email address. So she is the seller agent. The only time you'll be a dual agent is if up here, Century 21 Crime Realtors is on both lines here. In other words, it could be you're writing an offer on a company listing from a different office. Doesn't matter. You're going to be a dual agent in that case, even though you've never met the seller. Our idea there is to make sure that we're explaining to the seller that we do practice dual agency. Dual agency means that the company is always a dual agent. The buyer and seller agent could be dual agents unless they practice designated agency. But as I just said, we don't. So we are all dual agents when we sell a company listing, even if it's our own listing and we sell it, or if it's not. So hopefully that clears that record up. I'll mention briefly that there's a transactional licensee block here, rarely used because you're always going to be representing somebody unless you're not. Let me give you a scenario where that might be used. You might have a friend of yours who says, hey, I'm selling my property myself. I need some help to get this thing to closing. Can you help me? Well, of course I can. First off, I'm not going to list the property because I'm not going to spend any money to market the property, but I can also collect a fee not representing any party, simply facilitating the paperwork and maybe getting them to the title company. That doesn't mean we do that for free. Okay, so even though we're going to be checking no business relationship up here and that we're a transaction licensee down here, we can still list our company on here. We can still list our name in both places, and we're basically facilitating the sale. And when I do that, I generally charge between 2 and 3%. Sometimes I get the buyer side to pay 1/2 of the commission, sometimes the seller side. Sometimes the seller's happy to pay both sides of the commission. In a normal transaction, the seller always pays the commission. But in a private sale like that, let's say you're selling a property from the parents to the kid. Okay, and you want to facilitate this. Well, the parents will likely pay your fee, in which case I generally say, look, that's fine. I'll just do it for 2%. So you still have the right to collect a fee for your services. And that's exactly what you're doing. And by the way, your fee will by far be less than what an attorney is going to charge them for. And you will probably know more than the attorney does when it comes to preparing a contract. Amazingly enough, attorneys don't know what they like you to believe that they know. Okay. You have this block down here, which we wouldn't be using in this case, but you should be aware of it. If you are going to be practicing dual agency, you have to read this disclosure right here. We're not in this case, therefore we can skip it. In fact, the way I address this to the people is I say to them, well, Justin, Julie, I'm representing you for this sale, so we're not practicing dual agency. So I go right past that. You'll notice, by the way, every page requires buyer initials and seller initials. And while I do have this under contract and I have a signed copy, I'm showing you the original draft. The signed copy is also in this folder, but it's not that important to our clause right now. And you can see it's pretty recent. I just put this sale together a week ago, 364.9. Okay, the buyer is putting $5,000 down. So the date's going to be filled in here, the date that you plan to have the papers signed by your buyer. Not necessarily when the seller's going to sign them, but remember, you're the person preparing the contract for the person you represent, which is the buyer. So you have that conversation with them. Well, the property's on the market for 364.9. What do you want to offer? In this case, they offered 364.9. We wrote this contract on March 16th. It automatically types it in here when you fill this out. You have access to this program, by the way. Now, the initial deposit is due within blank days 5 if not specified. So you'll notice in several parts of the contract, there's a place where you can change the default time. I didn't in this case, and most times you do not need to, okay? But if I would need to, that's where I would do it, okay? 5 if not specified. There's a second line here that says additional deposit within blank days of the execution date. If you need a second deposit, that would be the place to do it. Now, let me give you the scenario where that might happen. Most sellers will not take a property off the market today without some kind of serious deposit. And 5,000 isn't that serious, but it's still not necessarily what I call walkaway dollars. A lot of times, a lot of agents get trapped into this thing where, oh, you just need to put $1,000 down, and that'll get us our offer to looked at. And it's true, it will. Okay, because for a contract to be legal, it has to be backed by consideration. However, if you get in the habit of getting weak deposits, you're going to have weak sales and you're going to have weak offers. And you really don't want to do that when you're trying to do the best for your clients. So have the conversation with the buyer. It says, look, let's show them we mean business. You're going to be buying this property. You're going to be putting several $1,000s down. How much can you part with right now? I usually get between $5,000 and $10,000 down. Okay. In this case, we got away with 5 because my buyer has another house to sell and is not making this sale contingent upon a sale of that one, but it means they don't have all their money up front just yet. So we worked with 5,000 and the deal was accepted. But let's say you had a buyer that said, well, I can only give you 1,000 now. Good. We can get started with that. But let me ask you, how much would you be willing to put down should the seller accept our offer? And how much time do you need to get that extra money? And that's where this second line would come in. I have another contract on one of my listings right now where the buyer put $1,000 down. I said, well, we like your offer, but we're not willing to accept your offer with only $1,000. And the answer was, well, he's got to get his money out of his IRA. That's going to take a couple of weeks. Okay, how much time does he need? And they said, okay, he needs like 2 weeks. So on that contract, when I accepted on behalf of the seller, we made a change and said, send me an additional $9,000 within 14 days to the execution date. And that was filled in right here. So you can see these lines are here for that purpose. Line 3, I've never used, but it's there so you can write something ridiculous in there if you think you need to. You can put anything in the contract and it can be legal. However, you can't put your firstborn in this line right here, just so you know, in case you were thinking that you could do that. Okay. All right. Important clause in paragraph B, that's why it's in bold. All funds paid by buyer, including deposit monies, will be paid by check, cashier's check, or wired funds. And all funds paid by buyer within 30 days of settlement have to be certified funds. Okay. Cashier's check or wired funds, but not a personal check. So you can accept a personal check as an initial deposit as long as your settlement is going to be more than 30 days away, which in most cases it will be. Okay. However, you should also know that while the contract permits that, there are some offices out there now that will not accept a personal check under any conditions. If that's the case and that's the practice of that agency, then you have to get certified funds up front. It's not that difficult, by the way. Okay. You get 5 days to do this. So if once your offer gets accepted, I've got 5 days to get that $5,000 to them. And if that means, hey, you got to stop at the bank and get a certified check, or you can do a wire as well. Wire actually costs more. So people generally get a certified check, then which is commonly also called a bank check, certified funds. Okay. Then that's the way it's done most times. Let's say you have a second deposit that is going to be due in 2 weeks. And if that deposit falls within that 30-day window, then you might get away with a first check that's personal, but the second deposit might be required for certified funds. Either way, you just need to pay attention to that clause. That's not us being a pain in the butt, by the way. This contract is based on the law in the state of Pennsylvania, has to be approved by the Real Estate Commission. This is a rule of the Real Estate Commission. We have to comply. It says deposits, regardless of the form of payment, will be in U.S. dollars to the broker for the seller unless otherwise stated here. Now, in our case here, when we're on the seller side, we always accept the deposit money on behalf of the seller. Here, once again, there are some agencies out there with limited services that do not want to be responsible for escrow. If that's the case, then they will usually bow to the buyer agent to hold the funds. You would have to write that in here. Other than that, you would normally leave this blank. And of course, in this case, I did. Another block to be aware of is what's called a seller assist. I'm not using that in this case, and it's not getting used very much right now, but let me explain what it is. Legally, a seller can pay some of the buyer's closing costs. We do this all the time, or I should say we used to when we were dealing with VA contracts, because a VA contract doesn't require any money down, and a seller could pay up to 6% of the buyer's closing costs, which will usually mean all of it, as a part of their negotiation on getting their offer accepted. This is the block you would use to write that. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, except to say that if you're doing a seller assist right now and you're competing with other contracts, yours probably won't be the winning bid of the day. But never say never. They can happen still, depending on the circumstances of the situation. And if you are asking for a seller assist in the current market right now, you're usually going up here and padding the new price with it. So let's say this buyer was asking for, let's say, 3% seller assist. On this price here, that would be $9,000, $10,000, almost $11,000. Well, I would probably take the offer up to like, 377 and say, but we need 11,000 back in seller assist. That would still represent a full price offer, and I'd still be able to help my buyer get the seller assist. When does your buyer need the seller assist? When they're a first-time buyer and when they probably haven't saved up enough money. Most first-time buyers need some help to buy a house. Once again, if you're a first-time buyer in the current market and you haven't saved up enough money, it is more of a struggle to find you a house. So one of the questions, and I'll cover this later in the week, one of the questions you want to find out from your buyer is how much cash they have available for their purchase, including down payment and closing costs. If they need a seller assist, I'll tell them, well, that's tough, but it's not undoable. We just need to, write a pretty decent letter of explanation as to why you need that. Obviously, in this case, this buyer does not need a seller assist, so it's blank, it doesn't apply. Now, here's an important note that you want to take, and maybe make this note on the side. We made this settlement May 16th. Settlement should be no less than 45 days unless it's a cash offer, which this one is not. Okay. And the reason I say that isn't because we want to drag our heels. It isn't because the buyer wouldn't like to move in within 30 days. It's because you probably can't. It's very, very difficult to get everything done in 30 days on a sale, unless there's no bank involved. There's no bank involved, then the only thing you're usually dealing with are inspections and title work. Okay, maybe attorney title work if you're dealing with an attorney. Either way, you can usually get everything you need to do that within a 30-day window. Used to be we could get it done in a week or even 10 days. We can't now. The reason we can't now is because we can't get the tax office to assist us in getting that done. One of the things you need to do before you can settle on a property, you have to get what's called a tax certification. In other words, we have to find out if the seller paid their taxes or not, because the title company is not going to issue a title policy on this property if we don't know if the taxes are paid or not. And for that reason, we need to get the tax certifications. They are taking 2 to 3 weeks right now, depending on what county you're getting the tax record from. Okay. And yeah, you can have sellers tell you all day long, oh, I paid the tax on the property. Yeah, maybe you did. We still need that tax certification because the underwriter at the title company will not write the title insurance without it. So to make things easy for yourself, you want to work with at least 30 days for a cash sale. You want to work with at least 45 days with a finance sale. And as you can see here, we actually went with a 60-day window on this. And I'll explain that in a minute. We actually wrote this off originally for an end of April settlement, but the seller needed more time to find another house. So in our negotiation, we agreed to do a May 16th settlement. Keep in mind, the settlement date says settlement date is May 16th, 2022, or before if buyer and seller agree. What that means is that we don't have to do any new paperwork. If we get this all done sooner, we may still make an end of April settlement. And as I understand from the listing agent on this right now, the sellers did enter into agreement over this past weekend. I haven't heard whether their offer was accepted yet, but if it is accepted, we may end up actually still settling on April 30th. But my buyer was willing to let them have until May 16th, and that's what it says right here. Other things, just as pertinent information, and I do manage to point this out to my clients when I'm going through the contract. It says the settlement has to occur in the county where the property is located or an adjacent county. So you can't do a sale here and settle in Philadelphia because there's too many counties in the way. You could theoretically settle a property in Monroe County in Northampton. Okay, those are adjacent counties. Or Lehigh to Bucks County, those are adjacent counties. Or obviously Lehigh to Northampton County, those are adjacent counties. Usually the settlement is going to take place in the office where the buyer comes from. So we'll be using my title company settling in my office in Bethlehem when we go to the settlement on this, okay? But that's what that line means. At the time of settlement, and I just talked about this, the following will be prorated on a daily basis between buyer and seller, reimbursing where applicable any current taxes, rents. So if it's a rental property, there could be rents that have to get prorated. Interest on mortgage assumptions, that you're never going to find anymore. Nobody does assumable mortgages anymore. Condo fees, if you're selling a property that's in a condo or a homeowner association, those would be fees. Water and or sewer fees, together with any other lienable municipal services. You may be have trash also in your taxes there as well. You may have everyone contributes to the cost of a street lamp. Believe it or not, I've seen that one before. And all charges will be prorated for the periods covered. Seller will pay for up to and including the date of settlement, and buyer will pay for all the days following settlement, unless otherwise stated here. It actually could be negotiated. I've never seen it happen though, okay? And for tax purposes, they give you a breakdown on how they work. The short version of this is your municipal and county taxes all take place in the calendar year, January to December. So depending on when you're settling, that's what the seller is going to be reimbursed or the buyer is going to have to reimburse the seller for. School taxes always run the fiscal year. There are some areas of the state where it doesn't, but all the areas we work, it does. And that would be from July 1 to June 30th. That's called the fiscal year, pretty much like the school year works. So July 1 starts the new year for your school taxes. That's why when you get a tax bill in August and it's due by the end of September, that's your school tax bill. And that pays you until next June. So when we settle on this property in May, they've already paid the school taxes till the end of June. We're going to be giving the seller back the difference of those prorated taxes from May 16th to June 30th. And then the buyer will owe the taxes for the rest of the year after that. The county municipal taxes may not even have been paid yet because those bills just come out now. Even though they're billed from January 1st, they just come out now and they're not due until the end of May to be paid on time. So they're probably not going to be paid. In that case, what will happen is the buyer will be paying the seller for the taxes. The seller will actually be debited the cost of January until May 16th for their share of the county municipal taxes. And that's how prorations work in every way. Now, conveyance from seller will be by fee simple deed of special warranty unless otherwise stated here. You almost never have to fill this out. Okay. When do you have to fill this out? If you're selling a house that's in a condo association, or it might be a leasehold. If you're selling a mobile home in a rented lot, what I call a trailer park for all intents and purposes, that's considered a leasehold. And if that's the case, then it will not be a fee simple deed of special warranty. Now, you all had real estate classes, and I know they cover this in real estate school, but fee simple deed of special warranty means exactly that they're basically warranting the title on this property from the time of their own ownership. There's a general warranty and a special warranty. I've never used general warranty, but you learn it in theory in real estate school. And the general warranty basically searches back the history of the property till when Willie Penn conveyed the land or Christopher Columbus came to America. No one does that. Okay. They do research to the previous title owner, because when that person bought the property, they had to square away any debt and they had to get the title insured. So will your buyer. Okay. So they're only going to go back to that last time. All right. If you don't know by now, there's a 2% transfer tax in Pennsylvania when you buy or sell real estate. It's actually higher than that in different areas, but in the market areas that we work in, that's what it is. If you sell a property in Philadelphia, it's going to be dependent on the county, or the county that it's located in. Okay, and their transfer taxes are different, as high as 4.5%. You sell a property in Reading, it's 5%. Pittsburgh's 4%. However, all the other areas we work in, it's 2%. That is commonly shared, 1% paid on the buyer side, 1% paid on the seller side. So yes, it is part of the closing cost. You usually don't have to fill in anything on this line F, because that's how most of the time it will be sold. However, a sideline part of this that we do run into just recently is some buyers, in order to make their deal look better than their competition, will offer to pay the 2% transfer tax, saving the seller 1% and hopefully making their offer look a little better. If your buyer has the extra cash and they can do that, then they can. But keep in mind, sell price of this property, what was it? It was $364,900. So how much is the transfer tax? It's $3,649. That's 1% of the sale price. That's how much that transfer tax costs. That's why your closing costs are on average about 6%. Here's 1% of it right here. If the buyer would be paying 2%, you're looking at almost a little over $7,000, $7,500. Okay, close to that number. So as you can see, that's a pretty big enhancement to the seller when it comes to hopefully getting your deal bought on the buyer side. So just something to keep in the back of your mind as another tool that can help you maybe get your deal done for your buyer. Payment of possessions to be delivered by deed, existing keys, physical possession to a vacant property free of debris with all structures room clean at day and time of settlement. You must make sure you verbally repeat that to your client, especially when you're on the seller side, because some sellers think that they could just leave stuff behind, and they can't unless the buyer agrees to accept it in that condition. So you want to make sure your seller knows that more so than your buyer, but it's on the contract because all parties get to see it. It says, unless seller before signing the agreement has identified that the property is subject to a lease. So you may at some point in time sell a property using this exact same contract that's a rental property. Maybe your buyer is an investor and they're buying the property with a tenant included. In that particular case, you would check this box, which is a tenant occupied property addendum to the agreement of sale, which allows you the right as the buyer to look at any existing leases, terms, and that exist on that property, and also what the security deposits are, and also a disclosure as to how well the tenant pays on time. Tenants' rights are protected under the law, which means that if they're selling a rental property and the tenant's in there and their lease doesn't expire until next August, well, then you're buying this property, and if you plan on living in it, you still can't move into it till the tenant moves out. Can you still buy the property? Yes. Will the bank sell it, let you finance this property as your personal property? Yes, as long as you're going to move in within 1 year. If you can't move in with 1 year, then the financing is totally different. This is an investment property. So real important to pay attention to that. You will work with investors over time. As I said, you can sell up to a 4-unit building as an investment property, and your buyer may even plan on living in one of them. They can finance that just like their regular home. As soon as you get into 5 units, it's a different ballgame. Okay, so tenant occupied, if you run into it, that's all part of this thing here. Keep in mind, we're only on page 2 of 14, but I will tell you that it gets a little bit easier as we go along. However, this is the meat and potatoes that you need to really, you know, I don't know, internalize to be able to make sure that you're understanding exactly how to structure this thing. Next block is a time is of the essence clause, dates and time is of the essence clause. This is also another critical thing to pay attention to because this does not exist in all states, but it does exist in Pennsylvania. And the time is of the essence clause means that certain time frames that are happening on here are part of the law and part of the contract. And if we violate those terms, there are consequences we may have befall us here. That can happen on both the seller side or the buyer side. So the first time we see a time is of the essence clause is this one right here. Written acceptance of all parties will be on or before. Now, I wrote this contract on March 16th. It didn't get accepted until March 18th. That's the date that we put down here. So we went back and forth. We made a couple of changes. I then took the draft, made the changes, sent it to my buyer for signature, then sent it to the seller. Seller signed off on it, and I got it back. And now it became what's called an executed agreement. So at this stage of the game, when you're preparing the offer, it's exactly that. It's an offer. It's not a contract yet. There's a contract to be a contract has to be signed and accepted by all parties. So we write this with the hope that this will become a contract. We, in this case, used March 18th as the date. There is a reason for that. When I looked at the listing online, it said multiple offers received, highest and best due by, and there was a date. And so we wrote our offer, not expecting an answer before March 18th. Now, I normally, if I don't have that clause, I normally only use one day. So I wrote this contract on March 16th. I would have asked for an answer by March 17th. And in fact, I did in this case. But it wasn't happening because after we wrote the initial offer, we found there were multiple offers. We went back and we changed it. We changed our offer a little bit, and we changed the date for the seller's acceptance. That's why you see 2 days here. Settlement date and all other dates and times identified for the performance of any obligations of this agreement are of the essence and are binding. That's what time is of the essence contract means. The execution date of the contract of the agreement is the date when the buyer and seller have indicated full acceptance. So it's an offer until it's an accepted contract, and then it's considered an executed contract. There's an important reason why we use that term, because the rest of the time frames that are part of the time is the essence clause that's going to follow here all have to do with the executed date of the contract, not the original date of the offer. So you need to understand that, okay? The settlement date, as I mentioned above, is not extended by any provision of the agreement and may only be extended by mutual written agreement of the parties. So while I wrote this for May, what was it, 16th or whatever, 15th, it basically is the date of settlement. But if we settle sooner, we don't have to change our paperwork. We're fine. If we can't settle by that date, we would have to do an addendum and have it extended and signed by all parties, make it in writing for that to be the case. Certain terms and time periods are pre-printed in this agreement for the convenience of the buyer and seller, and all pre-printed terms and time periods are negotiable and may be changed. What you're talking about here is what I talked about up here. The initial deposit, for example, this date can be changed. Okay, so this 5-day thing is pre-printed, and if I'm okay with the 5 days, I leave it alone. But I could change it. That's what they mean in that particular clause. So the certain time frames. All right, paragraph 6, page 3, zoning. It tells you failure of the agreement to contain the zoning classification may make this a voidable contract. You don't want that. So where are you going to get the actual zoning? Well, it should be on the listing, but where are you going to get the absolute one to make sure that you've got the right one that applies to this property? Once again, the tax record. That's why I said from the beginning, you want to have the tax record available when it comes to printing up your offer here. And that's where you're going to get that. Another important paragraph, and this is the deal breaker, paragraph 7 is one of those paragraphs that I've seen deals get lost on it. And you want to make sure you're reading this verbatim, I should say, to your client so they understand it. And you want to make sure when you're on the seller side, you're doing the same thing for the seller. When you're representing a seller and you get an offer, you want to make sure the seller understands these terms. I'm going to do it just like I do it with my clients. It is possible for certain items of personal property to be integrated into the property that they become fixtures and will be regarded as part of the property and therefore included in a sale. A buyer and seller are encouraged to be specific when negotiating what items will be included or excluded in the sale. Now, before I read this to you, I'm going to point out 3 areas. B is going to say what's included. C are items that cannot be included because they are maybe not owned by the seller. They could be subject to a lease or other financing agreement. And D would be things that are excluded. You can take anything that would normally be considered a fixture and a built-in item, and you can exclude it if you need to. So let's go through the process and see what it says. So included in a sale, unless otherwise stated, are all existing items permanently installed in or on the property, free of liens, and other items, including plumbing, heating, gas fireplace logs, radiator covers, hardwired security systems, thermostats, lighting fixtures, which include chandeliers or ceiling fans, pools, spas, and hot tubs, which includes covers and cleaning equipment, electric animal fencing systems, excluding collars. Dogs get to keep their collars. Garage door openers and transmitters. Here's a new one that was added a few years ago. Mounting brackets and hardware for television and sound equipment. Used to be, we had our big old 25-inch color TV console sitting right on the floor. Obviously, it was not a fixture. It was personal property. Now we have flat screens hung on the wall. Guess what happens? You hang it on a wall by a screw or a nail. It becomes a fixture, okay? Now, the TV can be unscrewed from the back of the bracket, but the bracket's supposed to stay. The speakers can be taken away, but the wiring must stay for the speaker system. So that's where this became a bit of an issue. Now, it was more of an issue like 15 years ago when we started getting flat screens because, you know, they weighed a lot more then, and the brackets were like $150. Then there was usually installation costs, unless you were do-it-yourselfer. Now you can buy a $30 one because the TVs weigh, you know, ounces now in some cases. And literally the brackets aren't as big a deal as they used to be because you could buy them for $30 at Walmart. But still, anything that's attached to the walls by a screw or a nail is supposed to stay. Examples. Okay. You know, the nail that your picture is hanging on is considered real estate. Your picture is personal property. You can take it off the nail, but screw a mirror to the wall and that mirror becomes a fixture. That's the important significance on that. Curtain rods, blinds, shades are all considered fixtures. Curtains are not. You can take the curtains off the curtain rod, but the rods are supposed to stay. Anything that's considered a fixture can be changed as long as all parties agree. That's all we're talking about here. Here's some other ones. Mounting brackets and hardware for television and sound equipment. Unpotted shrubbery, plantings, and trees. What's unpotted shrub? It means it's planted in the ground. So I once had a client, I had the buyer in this case. We go to do the final walkthrough on the day of settlement, and the seller had removed 40 rose bushes from the property. What? That happened. Okay. Guess what? The seller found out, and this I blame their agent because their agent didn't read this paragraph to them. That's why I say you need to do this when you're on the seller side as well. Seller said, well, I planted them. I thought I could take them. Yeah. Did you plant your grass too? Did you think you could take the sod up? Well, you can't. You can't take trees either. Now you can do anything you want. If you say, this isn't going to stay, that's not going to stay, and a buyer accepts it in the contract, you can do whatever you want. If it's not filled out, though, it's considered the fixture and it stays. So you got a rubber tree plant in a whatchamacallit, a basket, you can take that with you. That's potted. And unpotted shrubbery, plantings, or trees have to stay with the house, as well as smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, sump pumps, storage sheds, fences, mailboxes, wall-to-wall carpeting. Keep in mind, area carpeting, you can roll up and take it with you. Okay, existing window screens, storm windows, and screen or storm doors. Window covering hardware, including rods and brackets, just like I said, shades and blinds, awnings, central vac systems, notice no curtains, with attachments, built-in air conditioners. Okay, built-in appliances. Built-in air conditioners would be central air or a through-the-wall air conditioner. Window air conditioners are personal property. The range and oven. Now, why do we separate the range and oven from built-in appliances? Because most ranges nowadays can be taken out and unplugged from the wall. You might think that that's really a personal property, not a fixture. It's not. It's still considered a fixture because it's part of that kitchen. Therefore, regardless of how it's installed, they put a separate thing in here that says the range and oven along with built-in appliances. Dishwashers, trash compactors. Haven't seen one of those in 30 years, by the way, since we recycle now. But at one point in time, we just put it all in one thing. It made it a little cube and we threw it away. Here's an important one. Here's another one where I've seen deals break. Any remaining heating and cooking fuel stored on the property at the time of settlement. Now, why is that important? Sellers, because we used to be able to do this, sellers think that they can have the oil pumped out of their oil tank and take it with them. And they can't. Now, I know with the cost of oil nowadays, I mean, it costs minimum $1,000 to fill a 250-gallon tank of oil these days. So you want to make sure when you're talking to your seller that they don't get any new deliveries that they're not expecting on their oil. They should stop automatic delivery immediately, because whatever oil gets put in there, and if they get topped off like 2 days before settlement, they just gave that oil to the buyer. You want to make sure they're aware of that. That's why you read this on the seller side as well. On the buyer side, you want to let them know that, hey, whatever oil is left in the tank is what you get. Don't expect the seller to leave you much. But here's another part of that. What is also considered heating and cooking fuel stored on the property? How about firewood? How about pellets for a pellet stove? How about coal for a coal stove? Those are stored on the premises. What's not, excuse me, what's not stored? Natural gas. What about propane? Propane is considered stored fuel on the premises. It stays. Now, there may be a qualifier for that one. I'll cover that in a minute. Okay, so dishwashers, trash compactors, any remaining heat cooking fuel stored on the property at the time of settlement, and if owned, solar panels, windmills, water treatment systems, propane tanks, and satellite dishes. Unless, excuse me, unless otherwise stated, the following items are also included in the sale at no additional cost. Now, in this case, we asked for the refrigerator and all built-in appliances. Where do we get this from? If you look at a copy of the listing, there's a listing for appliances as to what will stay at the sale price. You still have to print them out on here, because if you're offering less than the sale price and not asking for them, the seller can take them back. In this case here, we were above the asking price, so it wasn't a big deal. Now, paragraph C. The following items are not owned by the seller and may be subject to a lease or other finance agreement. Contact the provider or vendor for more information. For example, solar panels. People buy those and they don't generally own them. They're financing them. Well, guess what? That's a lien on the property. It transfers with the property. Your buyer needs to make sure they understand that when they buy this property and they have that extra bill, they're paying for the solar panels. Windmills, same thing. Although I've never run into that. I have run into solar panels. Here's one I have run into as well. Water treatment systems, and probably most common are propane tanks and satellite dishes. The seller cannot convey what they do not own. So usually the listing will tell you things that are not going to stay or things that the seller doesn't own. But these are questions you need to ask. Now, and this is a peculiar case. Usually you won't find excluded items on here. But in this case, we did have one, and I'll explain what it was. On the listing, and I took this verbatim from the wording on the listing under exclusions, on the listing, it said all salon equipment, cabinets, sink, mirrors, washer and dryer, etc. in mud laundry room and pool heater is currently not working. Okay, right, they made a note that the pool heater is currently not working and only one propane tank will remain on site. Hanging cabinets in garage will also be removed. As I said, you can remove anything you want if you disclose it up front and the buyer accepts it. In this case here, this particular house, the seller also cut hair on the side. She had a legal permit to do so, and she had a legal shop in the area. And of course, they made it a stipulation. Well, that was fine. My buyer doesn't want those things anyway. So they're going to be taking out the fixtures in that room that was her salon, her in-home salon. And there is a separate washer and dryer in the building. But they had a separate washer and dryer just for the salon, and that's what's actually not staying in this particular property. So those things we had to put in there. We signed off and we agreed to it. And the pool heater thing was simply a note that they disclosed that the pool heater does not work and they're not planning on fixing it. My buyer was fine accepting the property with that particular situation. In the old days, they wouldn't have been. They'd have asked the seller to fix this stuff. But in these days, right now, buyers are doing what they need to buy properties. Now, important stuff there. Hope everybody has a real good grasp. I know I spent a lot of time on that paragraph, but I'm trying to save you the headache of losing a sale because you didn't read the fine print. And it's really what it comes down to. As long as everybody understands everything, and this is a more complicated one than most, not the reason I picked it, by the way. I picked it because it's my most recent offer that I wrote. But it is something that you simply want to be, just cognizant of, because this is important stuff. And if you want to be the professional in the industry, you got to pay attention to the details. Make sure you're not getting yourself in trouble, or more importantly, that you're just not embarrassing yourself. I mean, I would be embarrassed if I made a big mistake like that. It takes I spent more time going through the explanatory information. Literally takes 35 seconds to read that paragraph. It's not a big deal. All right. Most of the time, you're going to be doing elected right here. I only say that because statistically, only 3% of the time do people pay cash for real estate. Even people who have the cash generally don't pay cash. Now, we have run into a bit of a wave lately where we've gotten some cash sales. And the main reason that has happened is because we've had cash buyers that are selling their properties in New York or New Jersey and coming in over here. But that's not the norm. Most of the time, you're going to be dealing with only 3% of the time that you're dealing with cash. Okay, so going back here to a finance deal, this particular buyer is putting, I forget what the amount was, but they're putting 5% down. That's what it was. So you've got a loan amount of $346,655. That's calculated by simply figuring out the 95% loan to value. By the way, let's make a stop here and point out an important thing. One of the things we'll talk about later in the week here is getting your buyer qualified. How do you do that? Well, you're not going to actually do that. That's not what you do. Now, I know they teach you some of the qualifying processes in real estate school, but it isn't going to be your job. You're only taught that so that you're aware of how the process works. What you want to do is at some point in time, you want to bond at the hip with a mortgage person because they're going to help you. They're going to be an advocate for your business. You want to find someone you like that knows how to get the job done. So when you talk to a buyer and they say, oh, no, I don't know who I'm going to use for financing. Great. Let me give you a push in the right direction here. And we're going to determine what type of financing they want. In this case here, where they're doing conventional financing, but they're a little skinny on their down payment. They're putting 5% down. I'll explain that in a little bit. So they're doing a 95% loan to value mortgage. So I figured that out from there. But more importantly, I had them pre-approved from the lender. The lender sends you a copy of not only a pre-approval letter, because you have to submit that with the offer, but they also give you a copy of their estimate of closing costs, which are going to be more accurate than anything you could prepare for your buyer. So I always get the lender's closing cost estimate. In fact, I never do a closing cost for the buyer unless it is a cash sale. Then I can pretty much figure it out because it's title work and the legal documents to be prepared, and that's it, and tax prorations. Whereas with a finance deal, there could be any number of things. They could be paying points on their mortgage to buy the rate down, all kinds of factors that could be in there. And different lenders have different fees. Some of them are kind of junk fees, but whatever, we don't pick that. That's just their established way of doing business, okay? So I mentioned in the beginning, you want to have a copy of the listing, a copy of the tax record in front of you. You should download a copy of the seller's disclosure so you have it to send. Also, along with that, to be fully prepared to prepare this offer, you need that pre-approval letter, and you also need that lender's estimate of closing costs. So those are things you have to have all ready to go by the time you get to this stage. Later in the week, I'll detail a little bit more on how to get that stage set, okay? But at this point in time, assuming you've got all that, then you can go through and prepare this, because all this information is going to be on the letter from the lender and on the closing costs. You don't have to figure it out. For conventional mortgages, you do have to list the loan to value. Amazingly enough, for FHA or VA loans, you do not. You also have to list whatever the interest rate is that the lender is quoting, and the lender if applicable. Now the buyer does get to shop lenders even if you put a mortgage lender in this block right here. You also have to give yourself a little bit of a padding because the buyer can't lock in a rate until they've made a selection. So generally speaking, when we get to that point that we're getting the buyer approved, we got to allow for the fact that between now and 2 days when we get a signed offer or the buyer applies for the mortgage, rates could go up. So we want to, take advantage of getting them in as soon as possible, but you always do a little bit of padding here. And should never be a reason. I got to get back on this one here. Should never be a reason for you to use a VA funding fee down here. It will always be zero. So if you are doing a VA loan, there is a way where the buyer can prepay a VA funding fee. Most buyers that go VA do not do that. I've never used it, but it is something there. So why I don't want you to wonder why I'm skipping past a block that's not filled in. It simply doesn't apply in most cases, as does this whole box on the right. It's still possible for a person to get 2 loans when they buy a house. I haven't done one in 15 years. So while the contract still allows for a second mortgage application here, you'll rarely use it, but it's there if you would need it. Okay. I have seen it in new construction, because sometimes if you're doing new construction, you might be buying a lot first, and then you're going to be closing on a building after that building is built. Other than that, I see no other reason why you would use 2 mortgages on a contract. You'll generally just use the one. Now, Paragraph B, line 111, is the next time when you will likely run into one of these dates, times, and the essence clauses. It says here, upon receiving documentation demonstrating lender's approval, whether conditional or outright, of buyer's mortgage application, according to the terms set forth above, buyer will promptly deliver a copy of the documentation to the seller, but in any case, no later than. What does this mean? Okay, so you can get your buyer pre-approved up front, and you do that. You get that pre-approval letter because no seller is going to take the property off the market without a pre-approval letter. And having that closing cost estimate helps a lot to you, so you know how much cash they need. Otherwise, you got to do one. So I get the lender to do it. All right, I'm giving them a deal. They can do the closing cost estimate. All right. So, but what can't be approved up front? The value of the property. And that's done by way of the appraisal. And we don't control when the appraisal is going to take place because the lender sets up the appraisal after the buyer makes the mortgage application. However, and here's another side note to keep in the back of your mind, the rule of thumb is work with it like a 30-day or more window here. This is all part of the reason why I said you need to work with a 45-day window to get to the closing table at a minimum, because between getting the title work done and a tax search back and the buyer applying for the mortgage, and we haven't even talked about potential inspections yet, the bank has to order the appraisal. Well, appraisers can be a pain in the butt. We don't control their schedule. And some of them think they're prima donnas out there. And the next thing you know, it's like, well, I can't get there for 2 weeks. And then it takes them 10 days to do it and get it sent back to the bank. Give yourself a 30-day or so window to work with for the mortgage commitment. If you do run out of time, you can actually buy an additional 7 days right here in this paragraph, because you can get a conditional commitment with any things that are still outstanding. You get 7 days to remove anything that's outstanding. That's what all this language says right here. But avoid even that hassle by giving yourself a minimum of 30 days to work with for a mortgage commitment. That's what you're getting here, a mortgage commitment, because the buyer gets pre-approved, but the loan is not committed by the lender till the house value comes back, and that's by way of the appraisal. All right. Okay. Rest of this language here, I'm just going to paraphrase. It's not all that important. It's more or less a good read for the buyer. It tells you that basically all the if the agreement is terminated pursuant to any reasons the mortgage loan is not obtained for settlement, then all deposit monies are returned to the buyer, except as terms that would be listed in a default. And we'll cover that in a minute. Paragraph C explains what the loan to value is. I don't need to tell you the loan to value would be the loan amount versus the value of the property. In this case, we are doing a 95% loan to value, but a buyer putting 20% down would be doing an 80% loan to value. A buyer putting 50% down, obviously 50% loan to value. FHA or VA could be 0% to or zero money down to 3.5% down, but we don't need to list a loan to value on there. Okay. Paragraph D basically explains the interest rate fee provision. Basically, we said on there that 4.6, but no higher than 5. This tells the buyer that once they actually apply for the mortgage, they must lock in no later than 15 days before settlement to make sure they can acquire the mortgage term that's listed above. So that's important. Now, paragraph E is an important one. This one is important because this is also a time is of the essence clause. What's it say? It says within blank days, 7 if not specified. So it can be negotiated and changed. From what? The execution date of the agreement, buyer must make a completed mortgage application, including payment for and ordering of credit reports without delay for the mortgage terms and to the mortgage lender identified in paragraph 8A, if any, otherwise to a responsible mortgage lender. So it says that buyer can shop, a buyer's choice, and broker for buyer, this is you, if any, otherwise broker for seller, the other side, is authorized to communicate with the mortgage lender to assist in the mortgage loan process. So we are allowed to help them do that. And the broker for the seller, if any, is permitted to contact the mortgage lender at any time to determine the status of the mortgage loan application. So yes, once you have a buyer pre-approval, the lender or the seller's agent can call the lender to verify that those terms are good, that you didn't make them up, so to speak. And by the way, you should never do that. Okay. Now, important thing in paragraph F. Buyer will be in default of the agreement if buyer furnishes false information to anyone concerning buyer's financial and or employment status, or if they fail to cooperate in good faith with the processing of the mortgage loan application, including payment for and ordering of appraisal without delay, or if they fail to lock in the interest rate as stated in paragraph 8D, or otherwise cause the lender to reject or refuse to approve or issue a mortgage loan commitment. Now I'm going to stop right here and explain something to you. You need to have a conversation with your buyer. That conversation has to do, and your lender does this too. That conversation is going to be to explain to the buyer that Good news, you've got a pre-approval letter right here. In this case, Justin and Julie. Let me explain one thing about this. This pre-approval letter is a snapshot in time of what you look like on paper. Between now and the time of settlement, you can't change that. So don't go out and co-sign a new loan. Don't open any new charge cards. Don't go out and buy a house full of furniture on time that you haven't paid for yet before you close on this property. Don't buy a new car. Don't finance that. Anything you do that changes your credit score can affect your ability to qualify for this mortgage. And guess what? If you do something like that, you could be considered in default of the agreement. That's why I'm having this conversation with you. If you do that, you could possibly lose your $5,000 deposit. So I'm here to tell you that while you might be anxious to go out there and buy new stuff because you got this room planned and that thing to do, don't do anything until the day you close on the property. Once you close, you can go out the next day and charge every credit card you want to the max. We don't care. It's up to you, but don't do it beforehand. So that's an important step that you need to kind of set in the side of your mind to explain to them when you get to this default clause. Let's see. The paragraph G just says that the seller has to provide access to the property for anyone who needs it, the mortgage lender, and if they require repairs to the property, they have to let us know whether they'll do the repairs or they won't. If they do the repairs, we accept the property. If they don't, we have the right to cancel the sale. That's all that means. Now, if you are doing an FHA or VA sale, and I should add here USDA, pretty much any type of government financing, you have to fill this block out and put it in the purchase price. If we were doing that 364.9 number that we used up there would be filled in here because it states the purchase price as stated in the agreement. It also states that the property has to appraise for the purchase price. That's all part of government financing, not required in private financing, such as conventional financing with the bank. But any government financing, even if it's through a bank or mortgage lender, you have to do that there. Doesn't mean you can't make the sale contingent upon the property appraising, but on conventional financing, you do have to do that on a separate addendum. With FHA or VA, you do not. You also have to check these boxes here that says, well, you have to check this box, which says buyer has received the HUD notice for your protection, get a home inspection. And we want to make sure they get a copy of that notice and sign it. They don't really have to apply for this one unless it applies. If you're doing a property with a Section 203K financing, then you would check this box. You probably won't do much of that, but I'll tell you what it is. So you can buy a property FHA that needs repairs, and you can get a second loan for those repairs from the lender based on the future value of that property after the repairs are done. That's called an FHA 203K financing program. All the lenders have it available. They do have some certain rules and regulations, and I'm not here to get into what those are. You can check with the lender on that. But if you are using a 203K, you would simply check this box as well. Usually you will leave this blank even on a normal FHA, VA, or USDA loan. Okay. Paragraph 9 says changes in buyer's financial status. If the buyer has any financial status changes that occur, that's not their fault. They could be allowed out of this contract, even though they may be denied the mortgage now. So for example, if the buyer gets fired or loses their job, okay. If the buyer quits, however, that would be something the buyer caused. And that would be, in that case, a default. If the buyer gets fired, whether it's justified or not, we're not here to judge. If you got fired or got laid off, there's nothing we can do about that. But the buyer may not qualify for the mortgage because even if they might be eligible to collect unemployment, unemployment is not considered permanent income and does not count for qualifying for a mortgage. Okay. Now you can be retired and be getting disability or Social Security or all of that, and that's permanent. And if that's the case, that does count as income. So retirees can still buy properties even if they're no longer working. But if you're laid off, meaning you're temporarily not working, that's the whole idea anyway, then you can't buy a property till you're, considered a full-time worker. Okay. So that's pretty much the change in buyer's financial. I mean, other things that can occur, and I've had this happen, what if one of the two buyers dies before you get the settlement? Do you think the other spouse still wants to go through with it? Now, they might have to. If they have the financial ability to do it on just that person's income, they're still obligated to the contract because this says change in buyer's financial status. If that doesn't change your financial status, you're still committed to buying the property. But if you only qualified for the mortgage because you had a two-person income and now you have one of those people are gone, you may be able to get out of the contract. That's what they mean by change in buyer's financial status. All right. Seller representation. Paragraph 10 is kind of important here. Status of water is pretty simple. It's going to be on the listing. Is it public, community, on-site, or what? In this particular case, this property has a well. Okay, that's on-site water. Okay. Usually if you've got a water meter in the house, it'll usually be public, or it could be community water. And if you're selling raw land, it would be none. Okay. So we're generally dealing with public water or on-site. Community water does exist in certain areas. If it is listed, it'll be on the listing. So you can have a water meter in a development, but the water is not municipal. It's owned by the development. They have their own water purification system, their own tank, all that in that particular community. There's not many of them around, but I have run into it. They do exist in the Lehigh Valley. And if you have community water, you'll still have a water meter in the house, but it's not paid to a public utility. It's paid to a private utility, and that would be constituting community water. Not very often you'll run into it. So you generally be checking public, or in this case, on-site. Septic can be any number of types of septics. The most common, oh, by the way, if it's public sewer, you just check this and you're done. None of this stuff here in paragraph 2 applies. If you are checking a system, you could potentially have a community sewage disposal system. I saw one of those. You might run into a 10-acre permit exception. I haven't seen many of those in years. You might find a holding tank. I haven't seen that in many, many years. Generally, you're going to be an individual online sewage disposal system. See Sewage Notice 1. Sewage Notice 1 is right here. Notice 1. It basically tells you how the existing community sewage system works, or an online sewage system works. This is just general information. You'll read that based on what you check up here for the buyer, if applicable. So in this case, we read them online sewage disposal system. In proximity to well would be also something important. If you run into those, that's what you do. Historic preservation, you won't run into this very often, but there are some areas in Allentown, Bethlehem, and Easton that have rules and regulations set forth by the Historic Society of those particular cities. If you are in one of those, they'll tell you that it's in the historic district and that you have to be mindful of those restrictions. You then, as the agent involved in that sale, are responsible for getting any restrictions against that property that the buyer needs to be aware of, so they have a chance to look it over. Land use restrictions, you're not going to run into this very often, but you should know what they are. Sometimes you'll sell a property that's in Act 319 or part of the Clean and Green program. This will all be listed on the listing if that's the case. And when you're not sure what that is, you can go to the contract and you can read individually what they all mean. They're all listed right here. Okay. But if you are in that situation, the general version of that is that if you have something over 10 acres and you promise never to develop that land, then you get a tax break. That's what they mean by the Farmland and Forest Land Assessment Act, which is also known as the Clean and Green Program, or Act 319 of 1974. However, if you do buy that property and then you decide you do want to subdivide it, and the township or the county or municipality says you can subdivide it, you will have to pay what is known as rollback taxes. In other words, maybe we assessed that property and the taxes were $2,000 a year while it was a farm. Now you want to subdivide it and it's been a farm for the last 50 years. You may have to pay 50 years of rollback taxes. It's basically designed to disincentivize you from buying and developing land that has been historically used as farmland. So just get used to the rules that you have to deal with there. And that's what they mean by notices regarding land use restrictions. And you can read all about them right here. All right. Paragraph E is real simple. Real estate seller's disclosure law. I already told you up front about the seller's disclosure. It tells you that not less than 1 and not more than 4 residential dwellings, you're responsible for getting a seller's disclosure thing. It says unless you are a executor or a bank. Okay. And that's really all you need to know about the seller's disclosure. You get a copy of it from the listing agent, or it will be, in all cases, almost all cases, is already posted online with the listing. You download it, you save it as a PDF, you send it to your buyer for signature, go through it with them, and you, if you have any questions about something, you can always call the listing agent up, who will talk to the seller and find out what they mean by paragraph 4B, line 127 on the seller's disclosure. Okay. Public and private and/or private assessments, if there are any, they have to be listed here. That would be a question that's on the seller's disclosure. So you should look at that up front. Paragraph G, highway occupancy permit. I can't see you ever needing this. Okay. What does it mean? Well, if you buy a piece of raw land that doesn't have a curb cut or access to the property from a highway, then you can't really use that land for anything. You can't build anything on it unless you get permission, in this case from the state of Pennsylvania, Department of Transportation, to do a curb cut and allow access to the property. This contract is designed for projects or buildings that already exist. You already have a highway occupancy permit. When would you need a highway occupancy permit? Selling raw land. If you're selling raw land, you're not going to use this contract. There's a contract specifically for raw land, and you use that one, and that in that case, a highway access permit may be needed. All right, paragraph H is a new one. This is actually new as of really within the last 2 years. Internet of Things to do, and they're talking about IT devices. Here's the important part to know here. Nowadays, as you're all aware, you can get a smartphone that works for your smart house, that controls everything from the temperature of your house or your refrigerator. It can turn your heater on and off, your TV on and off. It can work your garage door opener. In other words, it's like a free set of keys. It's part of your security system. So this paragraph is to remind the seller that they have to cancel those services, just like handing keys or garage door remotes over to the buyer at settlement, and cancel those passwords and give the buyer access to the system or to the person who can set up that system to program it for their needs. Because after settlement, you don't want the seller, the former owner of the property, having access to your garage door opener or cameras in your house or anything like that. So we obviously, as if we have needed something else to do, are now responsible for making sure all that happens when you're selling a property that has that technology. So now that's why it's put on the contract. As I said, this was only added recently. So just be mindful of the fact that if you're selling a house with a security system, it may be a smart home. And if it is, have the conversation that, hey, we're going to need to get all the contact information and passwords and all that for the security system so that we make sure the seller turns off all their stuff and my buyer can turn on all their stuff. Remember, on this contract, you're representing the buyer. So that's what you do. When you're on the seller side, you're going to go to this point. You're going to say, oh, by the way, what was his name here? That's not important. By the way, you got to make sure that we get all this done. Let me get that from you right now. Who is your contact person? That's your security company that set all this up for you. Just get it done, and then we're off the hook. All right. Waiver of contingencies. If the agreement is contingent on the buyer's right to inspect or repair the property or to verify insurability or environmental conditions, boundaries, and certifications, or zoning classification reason, or any other information regarding the property, buyer's failure to exercise any of those options within the time set forth is a waiver of that contingency, and buyer accepts the property and agrees to the release in paragraph 28 of the agreement. So that's called the buyer's due diligence period, the inspection period. Now, I will tell you that after doing this for 35 years, most everybody does inspections until the last 18 months. Now buyers are buying houses with no inspections. It's kind of risky, but it is the way the real estate is being sold right now. In this market right now, where we're dealing with more and more competitive offers on properties, buyers are buying the property and accepting the property as is. What can they do in their stead? Well, they can buy a home warranty that might protect them for some things down the road, but not necessarily all. Okay. They can still write a contract with inspections if they're just not comfortable buying a property without them. Okay. But we need to let them know that they have a right to do those inspections. But we also need to let them know that these are things that can put you in a, let's say, less competitive state when making an offer. It's up to the buyer to decide what they want to do. It's our job to explain their options. If they do inspections, the seller must have all heating and all utilities, including fuel, on for all inspections and appraisals. Okay. So this is usually not an issue. You're selling a property, usually utilities are on, but there are times when you'll sell a property that's vacant, and darn if the seller won't let the house run out of oil. And next thing you know, you're like, oh, so that's why it's put here in writing, keep the property, keep the utilities on. And now when you're selling a bank-owned property, a lot of times the utilities are turned off, the property's been winterized. You can, if the buyer wants to do inspections, you can have the utilities put on, but I will tell you the bank will make you do it at your expense. They won't do it for you. Okay. And they'll tell you in the language in there, if you do turn the utilities on and de-winterize the place, it's you're responsible for turning them off again or keeping them on until settlement if you're going to go through with the purchase of the property. Now, just as a sideline, if you're selling a bank-owned property, you're usually dealing with contractors who are going to buy the property, and they're well aware of these rules and regulations. And most of the time when you're dealing with a contractor and they go through a property like that, they usually do buy it as is, because after going through the property, they kind of are their own home inspector. But your general, yes, I'm going to live in this property and fix it up myself person doesn't do that. They'll want to have inspections done. So that's what it says. Now, the buyer can elect or waive any of the following inspections. So let's go through them. They can elect a full home inspection. which would include environmental hazards such as mold. Okay. They can do a wood infestation report, which is commonly called a wood destroying insect infestation report, or WDI. Basically, most people do this. It's not very expensive to verify whether there's termites, but keep in mind, this is not just restricted to termites. This would include powder post beetles, carpenter ants, carpenter bees, any number of things that also eat wood. Okay. I don't think beavers are listed on there. I don't really remember running into anything under wood infestation for beavers, but I guess it could be a thing if you're selling a log home, huh? All right. So elect it or waive, simple enough. Deed restrictions and zoning. Generally, this gets waived unless you plan on buying the property and wanting to use it for something specific. So this is a good example of one. This particular property, we had a licensed hair salon. If my buyer was interested in keeping a licensed hair salon at this building, they should investigate with zoning that they could still continue to do that if ownership takes place, or transfer of ownership takes place. They're not interested in that, so we're not worried about it, and we waived it. So what does this go in here? We got to list whatever the present use is. So while we did list zoning as being residential agricultural, how is it being used? Well, the tax record would also show that this is zoned as a single family residential property. Okay, fine. In most residential sales, the people that are selling the house used it as a residential property. The people buying it are going to use it the same way. We don't have to verify with zoning because the tax record already confirms that it's permitted use for the purpose that we have for the purchase of the property. So we don't need to make this, contingent upon verifying these restrictions and/or zoning. Water service, simple enough. The buyer can test any water they want. Now, it's usually recommended that if you're buying a house with a well, which this house has, that you do an inspection for the water. Because how do we know whether the system's working right or whether the water is polluted? Now, if you're selling a house that's public water, supposedly the municipality is guaranteeing that the water is not polluted. That you're buying public service, that's the way that works. Doesn't mean it tastes good. So maybe you want to get a system in there if you want the water to taste better. Well, that's up to you. But the water service, if it's municipal, doesn't need to be inspected. Doesn't mean a buyer can inspect it. No, they can. They can still do it. Probably a waste of money, but they can. Radon's another thing. You can test it or not. If you test it and it fails, then you're going to ask the seller to put in the system. They will probably say no in this market right now, and you'll end up buying the system. So it's up to you whether you want to test it or wait till after you settle on the property and test it. Up to you. On-lot sewer, if applicable. So obviously, you can't do a test for sewer if you don't have an on-lot sewer. Can you do a septic? Can you do a test for a sewer system that's public sewer? Well, you can certainly hire someone to run a camera down the main line going to the street if you want. But I think probably running some water and flushing a couple of toilets will probably do the trick. Okay. Also, the question will be on the seller's disclosure. Have you ever had any problem with your plumbing, including leaks or backups and things like that? And it'll be something that's listed on the seller's disclosure. So on a septic system, I highly recommend they do an inspection of the septic system. Make sure everything's working like it's supposed to. Okay. In city water or in city sewer, you just don't have to do that. Property and flood insurance. Well, you can tell on the tax record whether the property's in a flood zone. So do you need to verify whether you can get insurance on the property? No, you don't have to. However, sometimes people do check this because they want to be sure of what the cost of that insurance is going to be. And a buyer has the right to verify that the cost for homeowners insurance is going to be something that's acceptable. So it's up to them if they want to elect it or waive it. They only get one choice. They can elect or waive. Property boundaries. Now, this one's usually waived. And you might find a buyer that said, oh, I'd like to know where the boundaries are, until you explain to them what it means. Well, that means you're going to have to pay for a survey. And right now, a survey on a typical lot is going to cost somewhere between $5,000 and $8,000 for a regular residential city plot. If you got an acre or more of land, it's going to cost more than that. Okay, it could cost as much as $30,000. When you tell the buyer that, they generally waive it because they only wanted to know where the pins were. Well, usually you can get a pretty good idea when you read the tax description of the property. You can go out there and you can kind of do a somewhat measurement. You don't absolutely need to know exactly where the pins and lines would go unless you do. And when would be the case that you do? Well, let's say you're buying this property and you just need to know a setback requirement because you want to put a pole barn on building. Okay, you might be able to make your sale contingent upon that, and you may need a survey for that particular reason. Otherwise, you really don't need one. Lead paint. All right, real simple on this one. So if the property is newer than 1978, you basically waive it because you can't test for it anyway. It says lead paint hazards for properties built prior to 1978 only. After 1978, lead paint didn't exist anymore. Okay, so therefore you can test it. Now I'll give you the real world answer on that. If a buyer says to me they want to test for lead paint on a house that's older than 1978, I kind of read them the Practical Riot Act here. And I say, well, here, let me give you the bottom line. I can tell you right now and save you $100 because that's what it's going to cost you to have a lead paint test done, that someone is going to come in here with a probe and they will in fact find lead paint because the house was built in 1940. The question isn't whether there's lead paint here, it's whether it's an issue for you. You shouldn't eat this paint, okay? More importantly, there could be lead paint and it could be painted over 20 times since then. So the real question is if you really won't buy a house because your potential is lead paint, then you need to simply buy a different house than this one and not buy any house that's older than 1978, because no seller is going to go through the cost of thousands of dollars of scraping and painting every wall and every piece of woodwork in the property to sell you their house. They're simply going to say, no, thanks. We'll just sell it to buyer number two. So I'm not saying, because once again, in real estate, we're here to explain, not to make their decisions. So when I explain this to a person, they have to decide the answer to that question. If they say, well, then you're right, Tim, I can't buy this house. Okay, then that's no problem. Let's not bother with this one. We'll stop right here. Let's keep looking and we'll find you another house. Most of the time, when you tell them the story that way, they say, yeah, well, I don't care. I'm not worried about that. I mean, keep in mind, don't eat the paint is actually an important part. But there are some people that have legitimate concerns. Maybe they got small children. Well, if there's any cracked or peeling paint in the house, correct it. If you're selling at FHA or VA, they're going to list this as a repair anyway. For conventional financing, they probably won't because they don't care. All right, so that's the lead paint. Other is here so that you can put any other thing you can think of on there. Now, if you do inspections, there's a default time. In this case here, we were doing inspections on this property. I changed the contingency period to 15 days. Why? Because anytime I'm dealing with a lab report, which I am with a water test, because the sample goes to the lab for 5 days and then they have to get the results back to us. If I was doing a radon test, we didn't do that in this case, but if I was doing a radon test, then the radon test would also be something that has to be sent out after it's being exposed for between 48 and 96 hours. Then it goes to a lab and they mail you back the results. Well, that's not going to happen all in 10 days. If I'm just doing a home inspection to termite, 10 days as a default time is fine. But if I'm doing a well or septic or anything like that, that requires something that goes to a lab, or the septic system can take longer because they actually put a dye in the system, then they come back and probe the drain field 2 days later. So all those things take a little bit more time. So just get familiar with, or just get comfortable using a 15-day window if you're selling a rural property that has well and septic and you're doing those inspections, which we are. Okay. And that's on the signed copy, those are elected and waived as I just identified there. One other thing that also applies is if you do the inspections, okay, in that period of time, and you find problems, you basically have 3 choices. If the result of any inspections elected in 12C are satisfactory to the buyer presents all reports to the seller in their entirety and accepts the property and agrees to release the seller from all harm in paragraph 28. If the results of the inspection included in paragraph 12C are unsatisfactory to the buyer will present all brokers the entirety to the seller and terminate the agreement. So they can accept the property, they can terminate the agreement of sale. Usually those 2 things don't happen. Paragraph number 3 is what is the most common one. If the results of any inspection elected in paragraph 12C are unsatisfactory to the buyer will present all reports in their entirety to the seller with a written corrective proposal listing any corrections and or credits desired by the buyer. And that proposal may, but is not required to include the names of a property licensed or qualified professional to perform the corrections requested. And the proposal will provide provisions for payment, including retests and a projected date for completion. Okay, buyer agrees that seller will not be held liable for any corrections that do not comply with the mortgage lender or government required to perform the workmanlike manner according to the terms of the buyer's proposal. Following the end of the contingency period, buyer will have 5 days. So this period was 15 days. Buyer has 5 days after that 15 days to decide if they will acknowledge in writing the seller's agreement to satisfy all terms, or the buyer and seller will negotiate another mutually acceptable agreement, or if the seller agrees to satisfy all the terms, buyer and the seller enter a mutually acceptable agreement, and buyer accepts the property and releases the seller. Or if no mutual agreement, written corrective proposal is reached, or if seller fails to respond during the negotiation period, then within 2 days, the buyer can acknowledge that they will accept the property as is, or they will terminate the agreement of sale. So let me go back and sum that up. Buyer has the right to do inspections. They do the inspections within the time frame that's put here, 15 days in this case. They then go back to the seller and say, okay, here's what we found wrong. Here's what we would like you to do. Fix this or give us a credit for that, or whatever the case may be. Seller says, fine, I'll do all those things. Buyer says, great, we're good. Seller says, I won't do that, but I'll do this. Okay, we could negotiate that and maybe we're still good. Or the seller says, well, I won't do any of it. It's on you. Buyer says, okay, I'm terminating the agreement of sale, or okay, I'll go through with the property and I'll just accept it. Those are all the things that can happen. If the buyer terminates the agreement of sale, they get their money back, all except for anything they paid up front, such as you still had to pay the inspectors. You still had to do that mortgage application within 7 days, so you paid for the appraisal. So those are fees that a buyer could risk, but their $5,000 deposit would come back to them. By the way, we don't really want to be in this position. Usually we can negotiate through inspections. When you run into that situation, you get a hold of me or anybody else who's been doing this for a long time, and we'll step you through the process, talk to the buyer and seller, and see if we can help you get through it. As new agents, we're here to help you get through that process, because a win for you is a win for us. So don't lose a deal for something that we might be able to work through. Not all deal is salvageable, but most of the time they are when you talk about the practical sense of what needs to be done here. However, if the buyer doesn't do anything, and that's why I saved this for last, in bold print here, if buyer and seller do not reach a mutually acceptable written agreement and buyer does not terminate this agreement by written notice to seller within the time allotted, remember it was 2 days, so it's a total of 15 days for the inspections, 5 days to reply, and 2 days after the reply to come back and let them know what you're willing to do as the buyer. So you got a 17-day window. Once again, now you understand why that 45-day to 60-day window makes sense for your normal settlement here. You got to step through all the hoops here. Okay, then that's where the situation becomes dire, and you try to then keep the sale alive by basically coming up with something. But if you fail to do that, and you haven't reminded the buyer of these timeframes, then this buyer just bought this property. And if they try to get out of the sale after that time frame has gone, remember that's what dates time is the essence clause means. Then you now just put yourself in a situation where you could get sued because you didn't explain to the buyer what their options were. That's why I spend so much time hammering the important parts of this contract. Yeah, there's a lot of fluff, fill in the stuff that's there to save our butts, but this is the important stuff you need to know. There's 3 times when you can potentially negotiate a contract. First time is now when you write the original offer and go back and forth with the specific terms and that sort of thing. The second time is in the inspection process. And the third potential time, which we haven't talked about yet, is if the appraisal comes back and the property doesn't appraise for enough value. How we doing on time? Okay, staying on time here. Last thing we'll talk about on the inspections, there's a separate window in paragraph C here that just has to do with septic systems. It says, if a report reveals the need to expand or replace the existing individual online sewage disposal system, seller may within, and the default time is 25 days, if not specified, of receiving the report, submit the buyer the proposal to the buyer. Now, here's the reason for the 25-day window. And yes, by this time, if the buyer is willing to accept the property, but there's a septic issue, you're probably going to be changing the selling date, sending the settlement date of the contract. You're probably not going to get it done in that 45 days. Because what's involved in that is now you have to get the local sewer enforcement officer involved, what we call, the SEO. And they will then get out there and tell you what needs to be done, what permits need to be pulled, what repair needs to be done. Then you got a contractor has to come out there and do those repairs and let you know whether or not they'll allow anyone to live in this house with this failed septic system. I've never run into this. Okay. It exists. I've never had it happen. Okay. But the bottom line here is I have agents in the office that this has happened to. So I know of it happening. And this is how you get through it. Most of the time, a septic repair it can be fairly simple. It could be a bad, even an existing, I've had this happen. The holding tank leaks. Well, new tank can be dropped in relatively quickly, amazingly enough. It's not cheap. Costs $5,000 to do it, but it is not something that's hard to do. A really failed system is when you've polluted the drain field. That requires a lot of excavation and sometimes an alternate system to be put in, an alternate site for that septic system. Hopefully the lot's big enough for an alternate site. That requires now a whole perk test to be done. A sewer design has to be done just like new construction. And you can see it can take a long time to get that done. Then it has to be approved by the municipality. And we don't control those timeframes either. A lot of times if a septic fails, people walk away. But some people really want the house bad enough to still go through with the sale. All right. Let's wrap up the rest of the stuff here. I know we're only on page 9, but the rest of it is more or less fill-in stuff except the appraisal, which I'll cover. Important thing to point out under paragraph 14 is line 484. Here's another time when the default time is of the essence clause does take place here. Within another day's blank day, 7 if not specified, from the execution date of the agreement, buyer will order from a reputable title company for delivery to seller a comprehensive title report on the property, and upon receipt, buyer will deliver a free copy of the title report to the seller. What does that mean? Okay, so when you buy a house, and some of you know this, and for the benefit of those that are brand new in the industry and maybe have never purchased property, I will explain to you that when you buy a property, you have to get the title insured. Unless you pay cash, you can actually buy a house cash and not get title insurance. Okay, I would be a foolish thing to do. I've had many cash sales. I've had every cash buyer always do a title search, but it's not legally required unless there's a lender involved. And if there's a lender involved, they will not give you the loan without a title search being done and title insurance against the property. So when is it supposed to be done? Well, same thing. Remember that time is the essence clause. Here's the easy way to keep in mind. 5 days is the default time for the deposit money to be in there. 7 days is the default time for the applying of the mortgage and the title orders being done. Now, for your convenience, if you're not aware of this, we have our own in-house title company. Your buyer doesn't have to use our in-house title company, but if you get used to using them, you will see how easy life can be, because settlement will take place typically at your office or the place of your choosing. When you go with another title company, or they want to use their own attorney, which they're free to do, then they can do that, and settlement's going to be someplace else, and you have less control over the deal. What do I mean by that? An outside title company is not always going to communicate with you, because they're going to communicate directly to your buyer who doesn't even know what title insurance is. So you probably are going to be the best advocate for helping them to get that done. Another thing to know, title insurance doesn't cost any different no matter what title company you use, because the fees are regulated by the state and it's based on the sale price of the property. So title insurance is going to cost the same no matter who is doing it. The only difference is if you are doing the title through an attorney, the attorney legally is allowed to charge, and they do, an attorney fee on top of the normal title policy. So it will cost them more to use an attorney. Now, we can never tell them as their agent they should not use an attorney to do their settlements. If they ask me, what would you do? I can tell them typically most residential properties statistically do not settle with an attorney. Statistically, most commercial sales do. Okay, it's really your choice. If you'd feel more comfortable having an attorney, or you got a family friend that's you've known forever and you've always done deals with your attorneys, you're free to have your attorney do the title work for you. If not, then the only thing I could suggest there is use our in-house title company. I explained the cost is no different, and it will make it easier. Plus, they will directly communicate with me so that I can make sure we're on top of anything should an issue come up on the title work. So that's usually what happens. But those are the time is the essence clauses that you want to make sure you're paying attention to. I guess you could say there's time is the essence clauses within the framework of the inspection period, which I just read, but really the important one is the time for the inspections, then the time to negotiate those inspections. But these are fixed regardless of whether they're doing inspections. The rest of the language in this whole paragraph explains how title insurance works, that if they want to buy a survey, they can, and that they are entitled to an estimate of their closing costs before they sign this agreement of sale. Once again, where do I get that from? Unless it's a cash sale and I'm preparing it for them, they're getting that from the lender, and I get a copy and I have them sign it so they can acknowledge receipt of that. Other things in here under oil, gas, and mineral rights. I mean, I've never used this. I do understand because I am at PAR. I'm one of the board of directors at the state. And I do run to agents when I go to Harrisburg 3 times a year from different parts of the state where fracking is taking place and things like that, where oil, gas, and mineral rights are a thing. I rarely run into it here. I do understand that some of our Pocono agents do run into this a little bit as well. So it is something that does exist up in that area. I can tell you in 35 years of doing this, I've never run into it in Lehigh, Northampton, Carbon, Bucks or Montgomery County, the Philadelphia area. but there are pocket areas. So just be aware of the fact that that's on the contract, because in some parts of the country, I'm sorry, of the state, it is used. Same thing with cold notice where applicable. And if the property is a recreational cabin, you can still use this contract, but then you're going to note that here. And if there's a private transfer fee addendum, that you need to put that here too. Usually that doesn't exist in most cases, but if it is, it's going to be on the seller's disclosure. Notice assessments and municipal requirements. Now, this is important. If there's any outstanding assessments against the property, that's a question on the seller's disclosure. Sellers have to disclose if there's an outstanding assessment against the property that the buyer could inherit. Now, that's usually more common in condos and homeowner associations, but it can happen in a regular residential property as well, where let's say you're selling a property that's got a septic system, just got done talking all about septics, and they've been given notice that public sewer is coming in next year and everybody must hook up to it. Okay, well, if that happens, you don't really have a choice. The government says you got to do it. Does that mean the buyer should know that in advance? Because it's probably going to cost them, $7,500 to $10,000 that they will mandatorily have to hook up to it. Yes, once again, it has to do with disclosing. And this is what it basically means. If there is an outstanding assessment or municipal requirement against the property, that you've disclosed that. And then the buyer has the right to accept the property or walk away from it. If the buyer walks away from it, or here, once again, if they fail to respond that within that same 2-day period to terminate, then they've accepted the property. Now, paragraph B, as part of this notice assessments and municipal requirements, is totally different from paragraph A. So what that has to do with is what they call a certificate of occupancy. There are 14, I think at last count, areas in the Lehigh Valley that have a municipal inspection requirement. And by the way, the city of Allentown, the city of Bethlehem, and the city of Easton all have that. So does Bethlehem Township, so does Whitehall Township, so does East Allen. You got to look this up. It'll be on the listing. Won't necessarily be on the tax map, but when you become a member of the MLS, there is a list of all the municipal requirements on there. Make sure when you're listing a property, you check that out. It's a requirement on the listing that you disclose that. After a while, you just get to know where you're selling a property, if there is a or there is not, but it will be on the listing as well. Here's what it means. It does not automatically mean that the seller has to comply and bring the property up to code for your buyer to buy it. Now, you can make that a contingency on the agreement of sale. You can say that I would like to have this property brought up to code. And then if the seller accepts that, then they are going to do it. What is required is it's required that the seller have an inspection done by the local municipality telling us what needs to be done for someone to live in this house. So a seller is kind of grandfathered in. I just had a sale on a property where the seller was in this house for 45 years. She predates even having a CO requirement on this property. Okay, but needless to say, she's selling the property today. She's just went into assisted living, and now she had to order an inspection. We did that. We did not agree to do the repairs on this house because we knew she would need a lot of updates on this property. There wasn't a GFI outlet in the place, and the main electrical service coming in, the cable was frayed. I knew those are going to be big ticket items that were going to cost some money, but she's still required to pay for the inspection, which in this case was $150. So here's how it works. If required by law within blank days, once again, 30 from the execution date, but in no case later than 15 days prior to the settlement date, seller will order at seller's expense a certification from the appropriate municipal department disclosing notices of any uncorrected violations of zoning, housing, building, safety, or fire ordinances, and or a certification or certificate permitting occupancy of the property. If buyer receives a notice by any required repairs, buyer will promptly deliver a copy to the notice to the seller, and within 5 days of receiving the notice, they will that the repairs and improvements are required, seller will deliver a copy of that notice to the buyer, and buyer will, in writing to the seller, will make the required repairs. Is what we ended up doing in the case of that one, or they will not make the required repairs, in which case then they can accept a temporary CO or they can terminate the agreement of sale. If the buyer fails to respond, they're accepting the property. In this case here, on my one, not this contract, we didn't have that, but in the one I was talking about where the house had the lady was living in it for 45 years. The buyer bought the property as is. Seller did order the inspection, paid for the inspection. We got to report it what needed to be done, and the buyer was fine with that. They were buying the property at a discount price for the fact that it needed $6,000 worth of electrical upgrades. House is working fine, but the next buyer can't move into it until these repairs are done. That's the rules. That's what they mean by a CO. CO is a certificate of occupancy. Okay, you will run into it in those pocket areas. There's other things that can happen from that CO as well. We don't have the time to go into all the potential scenarios that exist in that, but the bottom line is the seller always pays for the inspection, not necessarily the repairs. Okay. All right. If you are selling a property that's in a condo or planned community known as a homeowner association, you check whichever appropriate box. Condo, if it's a condo, planned community, or homeowner association, if it's a homeowner association. And what this does is this allows the buyer the right to get what's called a resale certificate. It's the law. And basically the law says that the buyer has the right to look over any of the association's rules and regulations, and they have up to 5 days to look over those rules and regulations and determine whether they want to go through with the purchase of the property. Okay, that's what it says here. The property is a unit of a condominium, primarily run by a homeowner association, and planned community. And basically, what they want to do is they want to apply for a resale certificate. And basically, the rules are state right there. If this is the first sale, well, it's not in most cases you're going to be dealing with. Okay. Within blank days 15 from the execution date is the norm. Okay. Seller at seller's expense will request from the association certificate of resale and any other documents necessary to enable seller to comply with the relevant act. The act provides that the association is required to provide these documents within 10 days of the seller's request. Seller delivers a copy to the buyer. All documents received in the association. Under the act, seller is not liable to buyer for the failure of the association to provide the certificate in a timely manner. The act provides that the buyer may declare the agreement void at any time before the buyer receives the association documents and for 5 days after receipt or until settlement, whichever occurs first. Buyer's notice to seller must be in writing upon buyer declaring the agreement to be void, and all deposit monies are returned to the buyer according to the terms of paragraph 26 of the agreement. We don't run into this much, but you will run into it at some point in time. And if there is an association involved, just be aware that you need to get all the documents downloaded. What I do when I'm listing a property that's in an HOA or a condo is I try to get those documents up front from the seller, scan them. Some of them are 80 pages, by the way. Okay. I try not to have to spend the money on the copier, but I will go through and scan all the documents so I can email them out. And that usually suffices in taking care of it. Unfortunately, some of them are actually in a printed book. Really hard to do that without copying them. I can still make each page copy. What a pain in the ass it is, I will tell you that. But after I do it, I can then scan each of the pages after I printed it one time, and now I forever have that. Ask when you have one of those. We may have a copy of their latest rules if somebody else in the company's had a recent sale there. But just be aware how the rules work on that. Real estate taxes and assessed values are put on there to explain that basically the taxing authority has the right to change taxes during the process of this sale. That's not a voidable clause in a contract. So if the taxes go up between the time you made and execute a contract but haven't settled yet, we don't control what the tax office does. We usually do know that's going to happen in advance, but we don't know it all the time. It is not a clause that allows the buyer to quit the sale. Okay, just so you're aware of that. Maintenance and risk of loss is fairly simple. This is more of a notice to the seller than it is to the buyer, but it's a protection for the buyer. So the buyer looks at the property, and now, as you see, it might be 45 days or 60 days before they get back in there and are going to own it. And of course, for that reason, they do get to do a walkthrough of the property, and in some cases too. So the seller is put on notice that you got to keep the property in good repair. If something breaks between now and the time of settlement, you got to fix it. If the buyer does their walkthrough and finds the kitchen faucet leaking, well, that's a problem, and that's going to delay settlement, and the seller's going to have to get that fixed. But it also has to do with keeping the driveway shoveled and the lawn mowed, depending on what season you're in. Okay. And probably the most important part of this clause is they have to keep the building insured. So you can't cancel your insurance because the buyer went under contract with you. Because if something happens, the building burns down the day before settlement, guess what? The buyer is not buying the property, and you don't have a buyer on the property. The contract is void. If you give it insured, by the way, it's not a voidable contract. Even if the building burns down, the buyer still has a contract. They still bought a building. It might not exist anymore, but the homeowner's insurance from the seller is going to pay to rebuild it. And just so you know, unless destroyed more than 50% by fire, the buyer is still locked into that contract, unless the lender lets them out of it and says, we won't guarantee the rate that long. It does become a problem. Okay. And I will tell you, most of the time, and we have had this, most of the time, if the building burns down, the sale falls apart. But by contract, it doesn't say it falls apart. If the buyer really wants it, they can accept a building, even though it might take 9 months to rebuild it. They can accept the building and postpone closing. All right. Recording, that's there to say that nothing gets recorded in the recording of deeds prior to going to settlement. That's illegal, and that would be considered a default of the agreement. So the buyer can't have this contract, take it in, and place a lien against it that they don't know about, and then walk away. That's a voidable place. They don't own the property yet. Doesn't mean they couldn't get a lien put against it. So that's where you got to be careful of that. That's why it's here. Also, the agreement is not automatically assignable. So you can't have a seller selling this property that they don't own. They have to have closed on the property before they can sell it to you. Likewise, the buyer can't buy this property and say, well, you know what? I've changed my mind about buying the property, but my brother wants to buy it. So let's just sell it to him. Well, that may be possible, but it has to be agreed to by all parties. So the agreement is binding upon the parties, their heirs, personal representatives, guardians, and successors, and to the extent assignable on the assigns of the parties here too. Buyer will not transfer or assign this agreement without the written consent of the seller unless otherwise stated in the agreement. An assignment of the agreement may result in additional transfer taxes. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes you'll have companies buy these flip properties and it'll say Bill Smith and/or his assigns. Well, you can do that and accept it that way. What that means is Bill Smith can now sell this property prior to closing, okay, and possibly avoid the transfer tax. Well, any good attorney or title company is not going to let them do that anyway, and that's why this clause was invented. Seems that was a common practice 40, 50 years ago, and people would buy a property, say, well, I'll give you this for it, and before they closed on it and paid the transfer tax and the fees, they had another buyer lined up, and they went from seller A, buyer B just act as a transactional person and made all the profit on it. That's illegal unless the seller accepts those terms, which would be stupid if they did. All right, 22, paragraph 22, real simple. It's the last 3 words of paragraph B, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. What that means is only the laws of this state apply to this contract. Don't tell me, well, in Florida, we do this. In LA, we do that. Well, we don't care. You're not in Florida or LA. Only the laws of PA apply. Because, for example, this time is of the essence clause is unique to this state and a few others. It's only something that's available in Commonwealth. Otherwise, it's like game on anywhere else. All right, you won't run into this too much, but it exists. So you do have to mention that the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act of 1980 states that you are stating for the record as a buyer that you have a legal right to own property in the United States. Usually it's a given, but it can be a little bit iffy if you're dealing with someone that doesn't have a green card or cannot provide legal status. They have to prove that they are legally here to own real estate. All right. Notice regarding convicted sex offenders, this is a hold harmless for us. This basically says that you as an agent are not obligated to look that up for them. But if they want to really know, they can go to the website right here. It's right on the contract and they get a copy of it. And then look up where the nearest sex offender is based on the address of this property. Representation states that any representations or claims or advertising or promotional activities or brochures or plans of any kind made by the seller, broker, or their licensees are not part of the agreement of sale. People can advertise anything they want. We're not here to verify that information. You as the buyer have the right to double check anything you want. That's why you have the right to do inspection. So while we might say, as far as we know, this is this and that is that, and as far as the seller knows, this is what they know about the seller's disclosure, but that doesn't mean they know everything about the property. You as the buyer have the right to test for, inspect for, or waive anything you want. And you understand that when you do that, you're buying the property in its present condition. There's a reason why that's all in caps right there. So basically all properties, for all intents and purposes, are sold as is. There's no guarantees from the seller. You're the buyer, the right in your due diligence period to inspect it. If you waive it, you basically roll the dice a little bit. Now, as a rule, it's not an issue, but it does mean that the hot water heater goes bad 2 weeks after you moved in. Well, that's a problem, but it's now your problem as the homeowner. What can you do about it? Well, you can buy an extended warranty. We have them available. You pay for it. You pay a deductible. It's going to cover important repairs that can happen after you own the property. And you can even renew it every year. It's good for 1 year at a time. You can renew it every year if you want. It's like an extra insurance policy, but that's there and designed to be something that doesn't come back on you. All right. Default, termination, return of deposit. Real simple. If you default, you forfeit your deposit. We're going to terminate the agreement of sale, and you're going to award the cash to the seller. If you terminate for a legal reason you have to terminate, such as we couldn't negotiate through an inspection problem or an appraisal problem, well, then you get your money back, unless the seller refuses to sign a termination form. Then basically, you have to take them to court. If you take them to court, you'll get your money back. And if it's unresolved within 180 days, here once again, a default time is the essence clause here, then the money automatically goes back to the buyer. It's that simple. Can be a problem. Usually it's not. And there's some rules in place that are explained in paragraph D and E. We, the buyer and seller, agree that we, the broker, who hold or distribute deposit monies pursuant to the terms of paragraph 26 of the Pennsylvania law, will not be liable. And buyer and seller agree that if broker or affiliate licensees is named in litigation regarding deposit monies, the attorney's fees and costs of the broker and licensee will be paid by the party naming them. Here's real simple part. We are governed by rules, the rules of escrow in the state of Pennsylvania by the Real Estate Commission. We are not allowed to distribute the deposit money that we're holding, except in one of three scenarios. One, a successful settlement. Obviously, that's 99% of the time what happens. So the buyer and seller are going to settlement. We're holding deposit. That deposit money, that $5,000 check is made payable to the title company, and we settle on the property. Number two, the property sale is terminated for a reason listed here. Inspection, appraisal, whatever it might be. And all parties agree, yeah, fine, okay, we'll give you your money back. We have a form, it's called a termination notice. It's signed by all parties, and it's specifically says who gets the deposit money. If the deposit money is coming back to the buyer, then we can issue a refund check to that buyer. The third way, and the only other way we can distribute the deposit money, would be if a court order. So in other words, the seller and the buyer didn't agree who was entitled to the deposit money. It went to court, or the time frame expired, the 180 days, in which case the money automatically goes back to the buyer. So that's the rules of escrow. We don't control the rules. We just have to abide by them. Okay. And that's why we hammer this language on here. So you'll notice on here under in the paragraph F, unless otherwise checked in paragraph 26G, seller may elect to retain those sums paid by buyer, including deposit monies, on account of the purchase price, or is the money to be applied to seller's damages, or as liquidated damages. If you check this box, which you should do because you are working for the buyer, then the seller is limited to retaining sums paid by buyer, including deposit monies, as liquidated damages. Don't forget to check the box. If you're going to say you're the buyer agent, you must check this box. And all it means is this. Well, if the buyer lied and they're going to lose the deposit money, there's no defense against that. Yeah, we can't protect against that. Yeah, it's unfortunate because now we're not going to have a sale. We didn't get paid, but we don't want to get sued by the buyer either because we failed to protect their interests. Remember, they're who we worked for. So even if the buyer lied and we have no defense against the lie, or the buyer did something stupid that caused them to not get this sale, then at least they're only going to lose their $5,000 deposit. They're not going to get sued for further damages. We don't want to give the seller the option to have the buyer getting sued in court, which means they're going to drag your butt to court, which means we're getting sued too. So you've got to make sure you check this box. I can't hammer that home enough. Where are we on? We're getting down there. Okay. For that reason, there's paragraph 27. It's called mediation. So the buyer and seller can submit to any disputes or claims that arise from the agreement, including deposit claims over deposit monies, to mediation. Mediation is held at your local board of realtors. All cases are generally heard within 120 days. The fees are a lot less to get started on it, and 99.9% of the time, the dispute can be solved at that level. If it can't be solved at that level, they can always go to court later. But what we're trying to do here is keep real estate matters out of general court, because here's the shortened version of that. If the seller has a dispute with the buyer, or the buyer with the seller, or even any agents involved, the seller gets an attorney, the buyer gets an attorney, the listing agent gets an attorney, the selling agency gets an attorney. Everybody goes to court in 2 years, and generally the only winners are the attorneys. So generally speaking, most matters in real estate regarding mediation can be solved for $10,000 or less. I say most. There are some cases that have come up that have been more serious than that. In most cases, it can be done at that. Generally, that's not even where the attorney's costs are going to be, fees are going to be on a for attorney transaction. So take it to mediation first. Try to solve the dispute at that level. I've only been to mediation one time on a case in 35 years, and my client won. It was the buyer in that case, and that was much, much easier. I also sat on pro standards committee at the local board of realtors for 5 years before I was on the local board of realtors, and then I was now on the state board of realtors. I've heard many cases in that 5 years I was on there. In other words, I heard mediation cases, 1 or 2 a month on average. and some of them were stupid. I know what I'm talking about when it comes to mediation. Generally, disputes can be solved at that level, and I heard many of them. I know almost anything that someone's going to say when it comes to what they're complaining about. And I can tell you on a one-on-one basis, if you run into this situation, how I think it will go based on what kind of case you have. All I'm saying is, for this purpose, explain to your buyer that if there's ever a dispute, there is help that's available to you at a low cost, and you're not required to have an attorney. Paragraph 28, we've talked about many times already. Here it is. After the buyer accepts the property as is for any of the reasons we listed before, having to do with inspections, having to do with appraisal, and agreed to release the seller in paragraph 28. Well, here's that seller release in paragraph 28. And it just states for the record, the buyer releases quitclaims and forever, keywords, discharges the seller, all brokers, also keywords, their licensees, employees, and any officer, partner, or any one of them, and any other person, firm, or corporation who may be liable by or through them from any and all claims, losses, or demands, including but not limited to personal injury, property damage, and all the consequences thereof, whether now known or not, which may arise from the presence of termites, wood-boring insects, radon, lead-based paint hazards, mold, fungi, indoor air quality, environmental hazards, any defects in the individual on-line sewer disposal system, or deficiencies in the on-site water service system, or any defects or conditions of the property. And that's the hold harmless for all of us, except for these last three lines. Should the seller be in default under the terms of the agreement? In other words, what's a seller default? Seller says, you know what, I've changed my mind. I don't like your buyer. I'm not selling my property. You can't do that. If you do that, the buyer has more rights to sue you than you have to sue them, because the buyer is limited to retaining sums paid by deposit. As the buyer sues the seller for a default, he can take it to court, cover his costs for him moving, his storage. He can rent a room at the Carlton Ritz for a month or two and charge the bill to you and sue you. So you don't want a seller default. I've never had one. But interestingly enough, it does happen. I've got one right now with an agent. One of the agents in our office said, sellers refusing to sell it. Well, we need to read them the riot act. So I'm in the process of maybe having the first one I've ever been involved in. So far, never had it. All right. Here's the other important part that comes back to the seller. So let me start that paragraph again from that line. Should seller be in default under the terms of the agreement? And here's the big one. Or in violation of any seller disclosure law or regulation, this release does not deprive the buyer of any right to pursue any remedies that may be available under law or equity, and this release will survive settlement. So the one only times I went to mediation for my own client was a house I sold. This is like in the early 90s. Seller disclosed that the in-ground pool, and since it was November, the in-ground pool was all covered, was in fine shape and had been regularly maintained, and even gave us the name and phone number of the guy who did the maintaining on it. That was on the seller's disclosure. Well, you know what happened that following May, when my buyer, who is now the owner of the property, opens up the pool, I get one of those calls, the one where you hold the phone 3 feet from your ear. After he calmed down, I explained to him, look, we do have remedies for this. And I explained that we're going to do some research now. And I called the person who did the maintenance of the pool, looked up the records. He said he never maintained the pool. And he'd been telling the seller for years that this property needed to be resurfaced. Seller said, I'm not going to put the money into it. I'm selling the property. Okay, guess what? A couple of months later, we went to court. We won. Make a long story short, the seller had to pay the buyer $8,000. That was in 1992 to resurface that pool. That would probably be $20,000 to $25,000 today to do that job. So that's the one and only time I went to court on a real estate transaction on behalf of my buyer, and we won. So I'm happy about that. So I don't want to make this sound like this is the norm. This is absolutely not the norm. If you do all the other above stuff the right way, you'll generally, but not always necessarily, stay out of this situation. Because even in my situation with my perfect record, it wasn't so perfect. I still ended up going to court. It happens. All right, real estate recovery fund. I shouldn't even need to read this. They cover this in real estate class, but you should be aware that there's a real estate recovery fund that exists to reimburse any person who obtained a final civil judgment against a Pennsylvania real estate licensee. That's you and me. Okay, owing to fraud, misrepresentation, or deceit in a real estate transaction, and who have been unable to collect the judgment after exhausting all legal and equitable remedies. For complete details about the fund, call the number. So, short story on this is, every time you pay real estate dues to the state of Pennsylvania, a portion of those dues go to fund this account. Now, what's the case of this? What's this really mean? And why does this exist? Because years ago, there were situations where whole brokerages would just close down, leave the country, and never come back and take their escrow account. Well, there could be a few $1 million in the escrow account at that time. And the real estate recovery fund was on the hook for making sure all those contracts were whole. So they basically insure every contract for up to $100,000. And we never take a deposit bigger than $100,000. Generally, the biggest one I've ever actually taken is $50,000 on a property. So most of the time, 5, 10,000, sometimes just 1,000, most of the time, and maybe 20,000 on occasion, depending on the price range of the property. Selling a $500,000 building, it's pretty common to see a $25,000 deposit. But needless to say, we basically insure every contract for that reason. Long story short, if you have a $10,000 deposit and you decide to take it to the casino tonight and you put it on black and you lose, and then you leave the country, that's an uncollectible judgment. Of course, your broker's still here, so he's going to have to pay it. And that's the case there. But the real estate recovery fund is there to protect the public. Headings are on this agreement are for convenience and are not intended to indicate all the matters in the sections which follow them. That's page 13. Page 14 has a group of addendums, and we're just about done here, that you may use if you're making a sale contingency or appraisal contingency addendum. Those are all listed here. The only additional term we put on here was the seller had said that they had documentation for the water results, the septic, and the pest treatment for the property. We made that a condition that says sellers provide documentation and or invoices as they pertain to the water test results, septic results, and the pest treatment for the property. In this case here, since we elected that as inspections for the property, we decided that if we looked at these reports and we were satisfied with them, we may waive doing our actual home inspections. Now, I don't have an answer to that question yet because it's so recent, but we're just about out of time here. So I will open it up and ask anyone if they have any questions. I will tell you that the classes the rest of the week will not take 2 hours. This class, unfortunately, takes every minute that we have of this to make sure we go through the contract. So I'll open it up. Just unmute yourselves, or I can just unmute you if you like. Any questions, just go ahead and ask away.
So Tim, Bill Lake, how you doing?
Go ahead, Bill. Hi, Bill.
Hey, thank you. So I mean, a lot you went over tonight. I assume
it's a cram course. Don't expect to know everything from this contract. This is a 30-foot look at the contract from the top. You're going to go through this in more details later. But go ahead. What's your question?
I was just gonna. I assume that you or someone would be around to guide us through these when we write the first couple.
So to everybody here, what I recommend you do the first time you need to do a contract, get a hold of me. I mean, you can go ahead. All right. So once you're fully up and running, you're going to have access to this program. It's our zip form program. We had this, we buy this license every year. You'll have all these forms. There's help topics on every one of these. There's tutorials that can help you through filling it out, but certainly you can go ahead, fill out as much as you can before you send it to your buyer. Ask me to intercede. I can actually open your program and see what you did, make any changes we think are necessary so that you have it right and ready to go. And also step you through the process of how to do it. And we will be doing this later on in the week, but step you through the process of how to set this up for a digital signature as well. Usually I'll help you with your first 3. You should be on your own pretty well after that. Unless you run into something odd, then I'm always at your disposal. I take calls today from agents 20 years here and say, hey, I ran into this. What do I do? Just call me anytime.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Well, now you know why we make this a mandatory class, because you really need to make sure you understand all this. And what you don't, you need to know where to get the help, because at the end of the day, the only way you and I stay out of lawsuits is to make sure we teach this the right way. And you might remember one of the forms when you did your license application that the broker signed says the broker is responsible for training their agents to make sure they're complying with the rules and regulations on how to do real estate. So having a real estate license is one thing. The second part of that is being properly trained by the broker you elected to go through is another. That's where my job comes in. So most important thing for me is to help you be successful, making sure that we answer all those questions. So I'll put it out on the table right now and say this. If you call my number, I will always answer the phone unless I'm on the phone, in which case I'll call you back in a minute because I'm going to finish with that call, then I'm going to call you right back. The only other time I won't call you back in a minute is if I'm on an appointment, such as doing this class, in which case I will generally call you back in 2 hours because I'm either with a seller, a buyer, or another agent, and I'm not available. And that pertains to the hours of 9 a.m. till 10 p.m. any day of the week. Okay. And if I do go on vacation, which rarely happens, but I was in Vegas last week for our convention. But if I do go on vacation, I do put a message on my phone and I have a backup person that can help you. And I do also try to get to my people when I am on vacation, but it just may not be immediately or in a minute or even in 2 hours. Sometimes it's the end of the day if I happen to be out on a boat or something like that, just so you know. But yeah, generally as a rule, that's how it is. So everybody should take my number down. My phone number is 610. It's on our list too, but 610-390-1687. Okay. And you can text at that number, and you can certainly call me at that number anytime you have a question. And if you need help with going through a contract too, and as we'll talk later next week when we're doing the seller side, I generally go with new agents on their first 3 listing appointments. Okay. Generally, after we get through the listing side of this, which we're doing next week, you should be pretty well equipped on how to handle pretty much the objections and a pretty smooth listing presentation, because it's a pretty dynamic presentation that I'm going to give you next week when we go through the selling side. Most new agents do tend to make their first sale with a buyer. That's why we try to cover the buyer sides first. Tomorrow, we'll be going through how to show a house properly and how to qualify your buyer while you're showing them a house. So that's going to be part 2 tomorrow. And that's an important class. On Wednesday, we will go through the multi-list on how to set up showings for a buyer and how to use some of the multi-list. And that'll be beneficial even if you're not on the multi-list yet, because you'll see how it works. You'll see a couple of shortcuts I'll give you. I recommend you have a notepad in front of you. I'll also have some handouts that I'll be able to email you to you as well. And that's it for now. Any other questions one last time? Otherwise, we'll sign off because I'm already 6 minutes over here.
Tim, I got a question over here.
Go ahead.
So about the inspections, the timeline, I'm a little confused. It's 15 days for the inspection, then 5 days to reply, and then 2 days.
Yes, you pretty much have it right. Now, I said 15 in this case because I used 15 as my initial onset because I was doing a test inspections that required lab reports, such as the water test in this case, okay, and potentially a septic inspection. Now, the bottom line is the period starts from the execution date. So hypothetically, this contract, which was written on the 16th, the execution date was the 18th. So my 15 days is going to run out. Well, let's see, 28 would be 10 days today. So my 15 days is going to run out on April 1st. Yeah, right. That's exactly right. Okay. 8, 9, 10. No, April 2nd. Okay. So we haven't run out of time yet. If we have, and that means that I'm going to know in a couple of days whether we're going to actually do these inspections, because we haven't done any yet, because I think my buyer's thinking of waiving them based on the report we have. But let's say they weren't and we were doing them. We would be doing those inspections. We then, after we had the inspections complete, have 5 days to do what's called a reply to inspection addendum. I didn't have time to cover that addendum today, but that would be the step that we would do. We have a reply to inspection addendum, and we would go through the inspection reports. This is what you'll do with your buyers. I'll cover this in a little bit more detail later in the week. And we find out what the buyer has objections to, or they would like the seller to take care of. Either they fix it or they pay to have it fixed, whatever the case may be. And if we come up to something everybody accepts, we do an addendum that says what we're willing to do. That's called a corrected proposal. If we can't come up with a corrected proposal, or the seller comes back within that 5 days and says, I'm not doing this. I'll do this item and that item. I won't do that item. The buyer has the right to cancel the sale, but they have the right to do that within that 5-day window. If they don't do that within that 5-day window, they have 2 days to make up their mind whether they'll accept the property as is or terminate. If they fail to terminate after that 2-day window, so that total of, which could be a total of 17 days, or in my case, 15 and 5, which would be 22 days, then the sale can fall apart.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that clarifies it. Thank you.
Okay. Probably it will make a little bit more sense when you see the other addendums we use when we get to the inspection process, but we have time to do that. We barely can get through 14 pages in 2 hours on this class. And that's why I consider this my most boring class, by the way, but it's probably the most necessary class. If you internalize this agreement of sale over time, you'll know how to answer all your own questions. That's what happens. You'll also become the expert in real estate. You'll be able to tell anybody anything, even some lawyers who don't know what our contracts say, how the rules and regulations work based on the real estate commission. Doesn't mean that there's there's not other rules and regulations you can use if you're not a realtor. But these are the rules we have to follow as realtors. We're in a higher class and level than someone with just a real estate license. All right, folks, thank you for your participation. I hope to see you all back tomorrow. Tomorrow's class will be a little bit more fun and a little less detail oriented, but still important because it'll give you some tricks to the trade. It'll let you be equipped to go out there and show houses immediately. First time you get a call from a buyer, you're not going to go, oh, what do I do next? You're going to know after tomorrow's class. All right. Thank you very much. And we'll sign out now.